Two nuns stared in one direction, shocked and tearful, as one turned to the other. Sir Luther, clad in armor, leaned on his sword, his mouth open and brows furrowed in alarm. The leader of the robbers, Carls, with a scar over his eye, eyed the object of his desire with a twisted expression, licking his lips. His gaze fixated on the blue-haired Sonia, who was gripping her sword with an irritated look. He remarked that waiting more than a month in these mountains had been worth it, as the girl was indeed as stunning as the rumors had claimed. Pointing at the girl, Carls observed that she wasn't just the eldest daughter of a prestigious knightly family, but also more talented than any male heir, even receiving a knighthood from the king at only 18. Sonia, turning around, noticed with dread that all the knights accompanying her had been slain. Behind her, the only survivors were two maids and Sir Luther, sitting weakly on the ground. Gloomily surveying the scene, she recalled that Sir Luther had long since retired, meaning she was the only one capable of fighting. Facing around 20 skilled men under Carl's command was the worst possible scenario. The scarred captain, curious about something, asked Sonia about the man escorting her. Sonia shot back gloomily, asking what nonsense he was spewing. She yelled in anger, questioning if Carls truly believed that her family's ancient knightly household would hire a weak magician as their escort. Glancing to the side with his good eye, Carls sighed with disappointment, stating that he had already figured out the man who interrupted his subordinates wasn't related to them. Placing his bandaged hands on his hips, the captain kept his eyes fixed on the blue-haired knight standing before him with her sword, amused by the situation. When Sonia heard Carls say he wouldn't kill her right away, she tensely shouted, demanding to know what he meant. The man, licking his lips with disgusting intent, asked for her opinion on the matter. Grinning widely, the robber captain raised his eyebrows, sarcastically questioning whether a knight truly needed an explanation for what was about to happen. Sonia, stunned, her eyes wide, stared at him in bewilderment. The robbers watched her with depraved looks, each anticipating the moment when they could defile the respected daughter of a noble family. Seething with rage, Sonia, her pink eyes blazing and her teeth clenched, muttered that this was absurd. Raising her voice, she declared fiercely that she'd rather bite her tongue than become a plaything for the vile men surrounding her, holding her sword at the ready. Carls didn't flinch, his scarred blind eye slightly covered as his face caught the light. The robber captain coldly said that her death wouldn't change anything, as the two sisters behind her would still be left for his men, making the nuns visibly more worried. With a smirk, he added that his gang had been waiting for over a month to catch the knight, and now his men were very hungry. Rubbing his chin, the blue-haired man smiled curiously and remarked that Sonia wouldn't be able to die with dignity. Realizing the horrific intentions of the robbers, Sonia thought bitterly about why the men had spared the nuns. The two sisters behind her trembled in fear, clinging to each other for comfort, and though they were initially timid, they soon shouted with conviction that they wouldn't be a burden to their mistress. Sonia looked at them, concerned, while the nuns gazed at her with tear-filled eyes. At a distance, Sir Luther clutched his wounded side, solemnly declaring that it would be an honor to die for the blue-haired knight, to which Sonia listened with sorrow. The red-haired knight with a beard, not taking his eyes off his mistress, sighed heavily, releasing a breath of steam. Sonia continued to regard Sir Luther with concern, unwilling to let him face death. She closed her eyes wearily and sighed, reflecting on the dire situation. After a moment, she opened her eyes slightly, casting a steely glare full of hatred at her enemies. With her back to her remaining companions, Sonia tightened her grip on her weapon, blaming herself for their deaths. A freckled nun with green eyes smiled softly and asked the lady not to have any regrets, while the other, plumper one, declared enthusiastically that they had grown up healthy thanks to the Aquaret family's care. Sonia frowned slightly but closed her eyes with a small smile, moved by the girl's loyalty. Captain Carls and his men watched the exchange between the nuns and Sonia with interest. The sisters, hugging each other, respectfully asked Sonia to end their lives, and she stood, shocked, her back to them, hesitant to fulfill their request. The plump-lipped nun smiled, saying that if they were defiled, they would never meet in heaven. Sonia's hand, gripping her sword tightly, began to tremble, and she reluctantly agreed to kill her loyal followers, hoping they would die with dignity. Raising his hands in frustration, Carls interrupted, demanding to know what nonsense they were discussing. Sonia yelled in anguish as she prepared to carry out the nuns' request in the name of their honor and that of the Aquaret house. Swinging her sword over the heads of the two humble sisters awaiting release, the girl tearfully cried that she would gratefully lead them to a new journey. Carls pointed his finger at Sonia, barking an order for his men to stop her, and they charged at her with fury, weapons drawn. At that moment, Sonia swung her sword, aiming it at the nuns. With her tear-filled eyes closed, her blade cut through the air with a furious force. The robbers stood frozen, mouths agape at the sight, and their captain began to scream. Sonia, her teeth clenched in tension, wept with her eyes closed, unwilling to witness the death of her subordinates. Afterwards, the girl opened her tear-filled eyes, casting a sorrowful gaze ahead. Suddenly, Sonia's eyes widened in shock as she saw something unexpected in front of her. The nuns, sitting on the ground, were still alive, looking at her in confusion. With her mouth agape, Sonia glanced at her hands, which should have been holding a blade. In utter bewilderment, she realized her sword had vanished without her even noticing until she opened her eyes. Gritting her teeth in frustration, Sonia cast a look of contempt towards those responsible for the disappearance of her weapon. She scanned the bewildered bandits around her, still unable to believe that they had been so skilled. Staring at her trembling hand, which had held the sword just moments ago, she gloomily concluded that she was about to face the worst humiliation as a knight. When Sonia apologized to the nuns for failing to give them a dignified death, the sisters looked at her questioningly, and the green-haired one called out to their mistress as well. With her back to the nuns, Sonia, as the eldest daughter, firmly ordered them to bite their tongues, prompting loud cries from them. Stunned, the girl turned around, her pink eyes wide with surprise. Captain Carls, smiling in satisfaction, concluded that the strong stranger had finally revealed himself. Fry stood next to the astonished Sonia, carefully holding her sword, and Carls referred to him as the ghost. Now, standing beside the shocked blue-haired knight was not only the protagonist who had skillfully taken her sword but also his companion Isabella, carrying a blonde on her shoulder. Sonia, along with the two sisters and Sir Luther, stared in amazement at the appearance of the heroes, who now stood a chance against the large band of robbers. Isabella looked ahead with a puzzled expression, holding the hand of a blond man who had one eye closed. The robber captain, still smiling smugly, remarked that he had heard some rumors, confirming that Fry had dealt with his men. Tossing the sword aside, the protagonist, gazing wistfully at the flying weapon, asked if Carls was their leader, while Sonia extended one hand. The blue-haired girl, her eyes wide with anxiety, gripped the hilt of her blade with both hands. Carls glanced at the ghost and frowned. Remaining calm as always, Fry said nothing and didn't move from his spot. Addressing him, the robber captain raised a finger and asked if the long-haired man had come from up there. It was indeed in the forest above where the robbers' base camp was located, as Carls admitted. Looking down with a grim expression, the captain asked Fry what exactly he had done to his men. The protagonist mockingly replied that Carls already knew the answer, adding that he had taken good care of them. Enraged by the response, Carls clenched his teeth, baring them furiously. He shouted, cursing at Fry, and commanded his squad of bandits to kill him before he had the chance to use his magic. As the bandits, following their boss's orders, charged at Fry with fury, they assumed the long-haired man must be a battle mage. Two of Carl's subordinates, screaming in anger, pointed out the obvious strength of the mage, though they believed he stood no chance against the sheer number of their group. Meanwhile, blue energy began to emanate from Fry as he concentrated, preparing to counterattack. White ribbons suddenly flew from Fry towards the robbers, effortlessly slicing through their bodies and decapitating them. As his subordinates' severed bodies were flung into the air, Captain Carls furiously tried to fend off the white ribbons with his sword. The blue-haired man, his mouth twisting in frustration, began to question if this could really be a display of magical firepower. Glancing ahead with concern, the scarred captain watched the devastating scene unfold. Meanwhile, the robbers were suspended in the air as the white ribbons slashed through them, followed by a massive explosion near the horrified captain. Isabella and Sonia watched in shock as Frey's powerful yet precise attack wiped out the robbers. Turning seriously to Frey's red-haired companion, the blue-haired girl, visibly displeased, asked who they were and what their purpose was. Isabella simply smiled with her eyes closed, giving no reply. Then her companion, still carrying the blonde, opened her eyes and tried to reassure Sonia, stating that they were not enemies. Metal Boots slid back under the force of the attack, leaving behind a trail of dust. Swinging his sword wildly, Carls tried to fend off the white ribbons, shouting that he knew a thing or two about battle mages. While continuing to defend himself, the robber captain smugly concluded that battle mages were just ordinary wizards and reasoned that his opponent wouldn't last much longer since magic spells had a cycle. Observing the sheer number of spells Frey had cast, Carls decided that Frey must be his primary target, begrudgingly acknowledging his opponent's impressive skills. Battling the white ribbons with gritted teeth, the captain decided it was only a matter of time before Frey either succumbed to fatigue or his men's blades reached him. With a crazed grin, Carls concluded that Frey's fate was sealed. Carls continued to focus on defending himself, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen comrades. He saw one of his subordinates struck through the stomach, and several others suffered similar injuries, their screams echoing. Watching the carnage in disbelief, Carls, now drenched in cold sweat, struggled to accept the reality unfolding before him. As Frey, surrounded by glowing magic orbs, continued to annihilate the robbers one by one with his white ribbons, their captain shouted in desperation, astonished by the sheer firepower, and demanded to know how Frey could wield so much energy at once. Exhausted and frightened, Carls gasped for breath, unable to comprehend how Frey had maintained his magic for so long. The long-haired Frey hovered in the air, arms outstretched, his back facing the ground, with his eyes glowing a brilliant blue. After one final attempt to fend off the white ribbons, the captain was thrown backwards, his sword shattered, realizing he had never encountered anything like this. He crashed onto his back, sliding across the ground, sending up a cloud of dust. His mouth flew open, and as he screamed in terror, spittle dripped from his bared teeth. The captain of the robbers, sitting on the ground, leaned against a sword stuck nearby and, extending one hand forward, pleaded with his enemy to stop. Frey stood at a distance from the terrified man, watching motionlessly as the corpses of bandits lay scattered around. The two remaining robbers, surveying the battlefield, screamed in terror at the gruesome sight. Exhausted, the men slumped to the ground, leaning on their swords or doubled over, coughing. Amidst loud laughter, Carls, clutching his sword hilt tightly, opened his mouth in confusion, realizing that the formidable opponent wasn't attacking. At that moment, the captain of the robbers, assuming Frey had run out of mana, pointed at him and yelled for his men to seize him at once. Weakened and traumatized by the powerful assault, the surviving robbers eyed the magician warily, while their leader bellowed that if they didn't kill him now, their own lives were forfeit. From behind Frey, Sonia shouted in disbelief, asking if he had indeed run out of mana. She then firmly declared she would assist him, only to be met with a cold stare from Frey. He raised his hand to halt her impulse. Lit by a bright magical glow, the protagonist turned to Sonia, telling her to step aside, as it was too dangerous, while he continued working with a magic circle in his other hand. Suddenly, the stones on the ground first trembled and then began to lift into the air. The surviving robbers stared in shock and confusion, their mouths agape in horror at the display of magical prowess, anticipating another devastating attack. Captain Carls, struggling to stay on his feet, yelled in confusion, unable to comprehend what was happening as the ground beneath him began to quake. Cracks formed under the feet of the robbers, spreading in all directions. As the ground under the gathered bandits began to collapse in a circular shape, they screamed, thinking it was an earthquake, while Fry watched them calmly. In an instant, the cracks widened, and massive chunks of earth started flying apart, dust billowing around them. The robbers cried out in fear as they fell, vanishing into the shifting debris. The men screamed for help, clutching at pieces of the earth, while their captain also cried out, terrified, his mouth wide open. Fry, holding his hand at waist level, remained completely calm amid the screams, while Sonia stood frozen, mouth agape, in shock at what was unfolding. Moments later, she gasped in amazement, marveling at the spectacle. As all four stared at the now empty ground, Sonia realized with astonishment that Fry had single-handedly wiped out all their enemies. Looking at the spot where Lucas had used earth magic to bury the mercenaries, Sonia deduced that the earthquake spell he had used was imbued with the power of 5 stars. Isabella, who was holding her companion, turned her head and explained to Sonia that Lucas had been buying time with these spells as a distraction before launching a more controlled attack. In shock, Sonia recalled the earlier spell and shouted to Isabella, asking if the storm of light arrows had just been a diversion. Puzzled, Sonia added that this was the first time she'd heard of such a technique as a double throw. Isabella smiled, admitting she hadn't seen anything like it either until she met Lucas. Isabella turned her head to glance at Lucas, who stood silently, watching the conclusion of his magic, his hair rippling in the remaining gusts of wind. Sonia, her face still filled with shock at Isabella's words, looked at Lucas. Along with the 2 nuns, Lucas, Isabella, Sonia, and Luther stood watching the dust rise from the aftermath of the earthquake. It was then that Sonia realized Lucas was a battle mage. A wooden carriage lay toppled on its side, its front completely destroyed, with debris scattered across the ground. Standing in front of Lucas and Isabella, Sonia thanked Lucas and introduced herself, giving her full name. Sonia Aquarid from the Kingdom of Lunoble. Lucas looked at her and introduced himself in return, struggling to remember where he had heard her last name before. Sonia flinched at the informal way Lucas addressed her, shouting at him about it. Turning fully to face her, Lucas asked Sonia if she had said the same thing. Suddenly, Isabella stepped forward, interrupting their exchange, and apologized, calling Lucas a man with poor manners. She then introduced herself, and Lucas turned to her, asking what her problem was. Sonia covered her nose with her hands due to the strong smell coming from Lucas and Isabella. Isabella, noticing Sonia's discomfort, asked Lucas if he could at least be half as pleasant as he had been with Phoenix. Sonia and Luther stood back, observing the quarrel between Lucas and Isabella. Despite the smell, Sonia struggled to understand who they were, though they certainly didn't look like vagabonds. She concluded that they were likely hermits living in the mountains. Standing beside Sonia, Luther remarked that he understood Lucas' origins, saying he came from the Blake family. Sonia asked if Luther knew more about them. Luther turned to Sonia and, smiling, told her about the Blake family, one of the strongest families that supported the Koskow Empire. As Lucas and Isabella continued to argue in the background, Luther explained that the head of the Blake family, Isaac Blake, ranked 7th among the 8 great ranks of the empire and was considered the 6th strongest overall. After hearing Luther's explanation, Sonia wondered why Lucas appeared so disheveled. Lucas, holding a squabbling Isabella by the head with one hand, asked Sonia and Luther where they were headed. Luther turned to Lucas and Isabella, explaining that they were on their way to the nearest town, having heard of a place called Hispaniola nearby. Lucas, looking at Luther, mentioned that they were also going there and suggested they travel together. Suddenly, a realization struck Luther, and his eyes widened. He turned his head to look at the bodies of the fallen escort knights, strewn across the ground, each one armed. Luther thanked Lucas for his help but explained that they needed to recover the bodies of the knights, which would take some time, so he asked Lucas to go ahead. Lucas turned around, asking Luther if they intended to bury all the knights here. Standing behind him, Luther explained that they had no other option since they couldn't transport them all to the town. Lucas waved his hand, indicating that he would take care of what Luther and Sonia couldn't do themselves. Instantly, the bodies of all the knights rose into the air, and everyone except Isabella, who had seen this before, stood in shocked silence. Lucas swung his other hand, using telekinesis to lift all the wooden planks and parts of the broken carriage into the air. In an instant, everything Lucas had collected formed into a cart with 2 wheels. Sonia's mouth fell open in surprise. It seemed incredible to her. Lucas approached the cart, now filled with the bodies of the knights, and behind him hovered a young man who had been a hostage of the bandits. Lucas asked Luther if they could leave now. Luther, still stunned by what he had witnessed, could only nod in agreement with Lucas' suggestion, while the nuns behind him rejoiced at the turn of events. Lucas and the group made their way down the mountain along a winding road that led to the port city. The cart hovered in the air, fully controlled by Lucas, directing its movement. Meanwhile, Sonia shouted in shock, questioning Lucas' age. She couldn't believe he was 20 years old. Lucas was visibly deflated as Sonia, biting her lip, had just told him she thought he was 30. With his hands in his pockets, Lucas began talking about how age didn't matter. Sonia, still not understanding his words, asked what he was trying to say. Lucas led the way with Sonia walking beside him, the cart with the freed prisoner floating behind them, and Luther and the nuns bringing up the rear. As Lucas remembered the mercenaries, he turned to Sonia, asking her if she found it strange that they had been waiting in ambush. Sonia stroked her chin thoughtfully, now recalling that the mercenaries had mentioned waiting about a month to capture them. Luther interrupted, causing Sonia to turn and look at him, and he pointed out that if the mercenaries had waited for a month, it aligned with the time they had left Lenoble. Luther crossed his arms and closed his eyes, pondering. He admitted that he had no idea who might be behind it, as the Aquarid family had many allies but just as many enemies. Sonia fixed her gaze on the path ahead, noting that even so, these mercenaries were highly skilled. She recalled the number of mercenaries hired, realizing that whoever ordered the assassination must have considerable power. Leaning closer to Lucas, she remembered how he had easily dealt with all the mercenaries and winked at him. Sonia then asked Lucas, who was walking beside her, how he had acquired such strength. Lucas glanced at her as she explained that she had always thought of magicians as weaklings, but today she had changed her mind. Sonia seemed a bit embarrassed as she spoke. Lucas raised one hand, pointing a finger, and simply said the most obvious thing. Effort. Sonia stopped in her tracks, staring in shock as Lucas continued walking. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and yellow, Lucas' answer, effort, seemed to echo through the sky. The scene shifted to a bustling port where several ships were moored. For men struggled to load the cart carrying the knights' bodies onto a ship using a ramp, while the nuns watched from the side. Shortly after, 2 of the nuns tearfully came to bid Sonia farewell, with one of them even hugging her. One of the nuns boarded the ship, waving goodbye to the other. Lucas, Isabella, Luther, Sonia, and the remaining nuns stood in the port, watching the ship sail away. Luther turned to Lucas and Isabella, who were also watching the ship disappear into the distance. Bowing his head and placing his left hand over his chest, Luther thanked Lucas, saying that thanks to him, the knights would be able to return to their families. Lucas smiled faintly, glad he could help. Isabella bowed to Sonia, while Lucas simply turned around, waving as he wished them a safe journey. Suddenly, Sonia ran up to Lucas and grabbed his hand. Lucas looked at her, asking what was wrong. Sonia averted her gaze and, somewhat shyly, asked if she could properly thank him. Lucas closed his eyes and smiled, saying there was no need for thanks since, after all, they should help each other. Luther nodded in agreement with Sonia, pointing out that if Lucas left without being thanked, it would reflect poorly on the Aquarid family. Lucas scratched his head in thought and then looked over at Isabella. She smiled and nodded in approval. Lucas then announced loudly, suggesting they grab a bite to eat, mentioning a place that served very tasty sausages. He led everyone to the same bar he and Isabella had visited earlier. Sonia and Luther were a bit taken aback by the interior of the bar. Sonia quickly covered her nose with a handkerchief due to the smell. Mercenaries smoked cigars, drank, and chatted at the tables, making the place feel entirely unsuitable for an aristocrat. Lucas turned to Luther and remarked that despite its scruffy appearance, this was the best place to eat. Just then, the bartender's voice chimed in, asking Lucas if his bar was really that dirty and shabby. The bartender, carrying an order for a customer, winked and said Lucas looked like a vagabond but was glad to see him alive. Lucas chuckled at the comment. Walking up to the bartender, Lucas turned and pointed to someone else who had survived. The bartender's previously closed eye snapped open in surprise. His son, leaning on Isabella, stood there. Everything the bartender had been holding fell to the floor. Kijani and his father stood facing each other, the bartender trembling as he reached out toward his son. Kijani's hands were bandaged as his father knelt on the floor in front of him, crying. Lucas, standing by the bar, mentioned that Kijani would need a few days to recover, but assured his father there was no need to worry. Kijani trembled as he wept, recounting how he had been held hostage while protecting a mother and her child. His father cupped his son's face, both of them sobbing in relief at their reunion. Lucas didn't know much about Kijani's talents as a mercenary, but as a person, he wasn't as corrupt as others. With trembling lips, Kijani expressed his deep regret for what he had done, apologizing for the days he had shouted at his father and run away. Isabella listened with a warm smile as the father rejoiced, knowing that the most important thing was that his son had returned alive. Leaning toward Lucas, Isabella covered her mouth and asked how he knew Kijani was the bartender's son. Lucas simply replied that they looked alike. Watching the emotional reunion, Lucas turned to Isabella and, with a teasing grin, called her ballast, though she was surprisingly skilled in healing magic. Isabella's hair began to float in the air as she glared furiously at Lucas, demanding to know who he had just called ballast. Lucas didn't back down and repeated the insult, calling her ballast once again. Isabella shook with a mix of rage and embarrassment, while Lucas nonchalantly continued forward and addressed the bartender. Lucas's entire group stood near the bar. He informed the bartender that they had come to stay, but the restaurant appeared to be packed already. Luther complimented the restaurant, noting how many customers it attracted. Lucas glanced at Luther, who then suggested they search for another place. As Lucas praised the sausages, the bartender trembled and chuckled. Suddenly, the bartender's loud scream startled all the mercenaries in the room, causing them to either drop their beer mugs or spit out their drinks in fear. The bartender glared at his patrons, asking if they had heard the news about the establishment closing. He approached the tables and began to throw them out, while the customers complained about closing so early. The bartender silenced them, ordering everyone to leave, saying he didn't care about their money and wanted them to get out as far as possible. After closing and locking the doors, the bartender turned around and spread his arms, asking Lucas, who was surveying the mess, what he had been talking about, since there were now no customers in the restaurant. Lucas laughed at the situation, while Luther and Sonia, on the other hand, looked depressed. The bartender reassured them, saying he would prepare everything, and they could relax and sit down. Isabella nodded, accepting his offer, as the moonlight streamed through the barred window, illuminating the room. Sonia was taking a bath, steam rising and filling the entire space. She raised her hand, imagining herself as a magician, her face showing a mixture of sadness and reflection. On the table nearby sat a basket of bread and plates filled with sausages and meat. Luther and Isabella looked at the spread with surprise as the bartender brought out more meat and fruit. Lucas, wearing a blue shirt, stuffed bread and sausages into his mouth, much to Isabella's shock. Lucas noticed footsteps and turned toward the stairs, seeing Sonia descending. Raising his mug, he said he couldn't wait any longer and had already started dinner, while Isabella gave him a jealous glance after his comment. Sonia seemed surprised by his words. Standing in front of Lucas, wearing a purple tank top and a blue cape, Sonia was asked if she was feeling all right because her face was flushed. Pulling out a chair, Sonia remarked that Lucas looked much more courageous after washing off all the dirt. Suddenly, She twisted her ankle, causing her cape to fall from her shoulders. Lucas quickly caught her, grabbing her arms and preventing her from falling. Sonia, now worried, opened her mouth, unsure of what to say. Lucas looked up at the ceiling for a moment but then noticed her scarred hands. He asked her about the wounds, and Sonia, embarrassed, pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself to hide the scars. But Lucas's words caught her off guard. He called her scars signs of effort, not shame. Pointing at her, he said those marks were a testament to the hard work she had put in. Sonia's face reddened, and she stared at Lucas in shock. Isabella gently raised her hand to calm Sonia down, and then turned to ask where her final destination was. Sonia replied that she was heading to June's family. Upon hearing this, both Lucas and Isabella exchanged a knowing glance. They immediately thought of Pierre, envisioning him in their minds. Lucas recalled how Pierre, while covering his eyes, had spoken of his daughter-in-law from the Aquarid family. He hadn't been sure if she would be a good match, but he had felt reassured by the reputation of the skilled knights from the Aquarid line. Isabella pointed at Sonia, realizing that she was indeed from the Aquarid family, while Lucas shouted in shock about marriage. Sonia, stunned, pointed at herself. Luther, noticing their reaction, asked if they knew Pierre. Isabella, gesturing toward Lucas, explained that both Lucas and Pierre had attended the same academy and that Pierre was their friend. It was through him that they had heard about the marriage. Lucas, finally stopping his meal, asked if Sonia was Pierre's fiancée. Sonia remained silent, merely staring at Lucas. He closed his eyes and bowed his head slightly. In the quiet night, Lucas's voice echoed through the restaurant, calling Pierre a lucky man. Later, Lucas and Isabella stood across from Sonia's group in the city square. Isabella stepped forward and wished Sonia a safe journey. Sonia turned to Lucas, and he met her gaze. Blushing slightly, Sonia suggested that Lucas visit June's family after finishing his own business. Lucas glanced at Isabella before turning back and saying that perhaps they would stop by. Isabella looked at him, puzzled by his response. Sonia smiled, saying she would wait for him. As they walked through the dense forest of the Spain mountains, Isabella came to realize that Miss Sonia was fond of people of noble birth. Climbing up, Lucas asked her about Pierre's luck, remarking how it had followed him all his life. Isabella narrowed her eyes and denied it, disagreeing with Lucas's statement. Walking ahead, Lucas turned back to Isabella, asking what was wrong with her expression, as though she had bitten into something unpleasant. At that moment, Lucas realized that when a girl liked something so much that she couldn't control herself, her sharpness of mind seemed to fade. He then stopped and announced that they had arrived. Lucas and Isabella stood staring at the massive mountain in the distance, which housed the entrance to Schweitzer's dungeon. Isabella's mouth dropped open, and her eyes widened in surprise. Drakes flew around the towering mountain, which was called Drake due to the large number of drakes that lived there. These dragon-like creatures with bat wings soared through the sky, letting out loud roars. They were the largest and strongest predators in the world of monsters. Isabella shuddered in fear, raising her hands and asking Lucas if they would really have to fight such powerful creatures, which were among the strongest in the monster world. Lucas pointed his finger at the ground and asked if that was all she had to say. Lucas stood with his finger pointed at the ground while Isabella's mouth dropped in terror. Right in front of them was the enormous footprint of the Drake King, a creature many times larger than any regular drake. Isabella collapsed to the ground, trembling in fear. She stared at the colossal footprint left by the Drake King, having never imagined such a massive drake existed. Lucas, standing next to her, placed one hand on his hip and told Isabella to calm down because they were in the mountains of Spain. Mana began to gather in Lucas's hand. In these mountains there was only one truth. No matter what happened, nothing here was strange, which was why the mountains were called the Mountains of Hell. Lucas directed his hand, filled with mana, towards Isabella. A gust of wind sent Isabella flying just as a huge red ogre with 3 eyes struck the ground with a tree it was using as a club, right where Lucas and Isabella had just been. Lucas quickly jumped back, dodging the blow. Isabella managed to regain her balance in the air and skidded to a stop along the ground. She raised her head, about to scold Lucas, but froze in place when she saw the massive ogre holding a tree. Isabella screamed, recognizing it as an ogre. Lucas narrowed his eyes, realizing that fighting the ogre would be highly dangerous. The red-skinned, three-eyed ogre was clearly a mutant, and Lucas smiled as he remembered the restaurant owner's words about mutants living in these mountains. The ogre's head turned toward Isabella, drool dripping from its mouth as it charged at her, tree in hand. Isabella immediately began casting a spell. With her arms outstretched, Isabella formed a fireball above her head and in her hands. As the fireball collided with the ogre, it was sent flying, leaving behind a series of explosions. Isabella herself was also thrown into the air from the shockwave. Lucas, whose face was illuminated by the chain of explosions, watched, noting the massive increase in Isabella's power. Fire and smoke swirled around the ogre's body, but from within the flames, a glowing purple eye of the ogre pierced through the smoke. Roaring, the ogre clenched its fists, and with its roar, the fire and smoke were instantly dispersed. Isabella grabbed her head in despair, realizing that her magic was ineffective. The ogre hadn't even flinched. Lucas, standing to the side, knew that Isabella hadn't yet realized how much stronger she had become. Approaching her, Lucas explained that the ogre's mutation had made it resistant to fire magic, possibly due to the influence of the drakes. Isabella gasped, exclaiming about the ogre's evolution. As the ogre approached, Isabella asked Lucas what they should do next. Lucas decided to switch to ice magic, as fire was clearly not working. Magic circles appeared in the sky above Lucas's hand, forming sharp icicles. Isabella wrapped her arms around herself, shivering from the cold. Two small ice spears hovered in the air, and it felt as though the season had changed. Lucas stood with his hand raised, the two ice spears hovering over it. Isabella glanced at Lucas and was reminded of Lucas Troman. Lucas extended his hand, and the two ice spears shot forward instantly, striking the ogre. One hit its head, and the other struck its torso, sending the ogre flying back. Isabella hugged herself with one arm, watching Lucas's actions with admiration. But both Isabella's and Lucas's expressions quickly shifted to one of fear and surprise. The ogre, with shards of ice embedded in its head and torso, slammed the ground with both hands, causing the earth to shake and forcing Lucas and Isabella to leap out of the way. Isabella stared in disbelief at the ogre. Despite being hit by the powerful ice spears, the ogre's impenetrable skin had withstood the attack, with the spears merely lodged in its body. Lucas and Isabella began to flee, the ogre chasing after them, smashing trees to clear a path. Lucas noted the incredible strength of the mutant. Isabella raised her hand and formed 3 fireballs in her open palm, quickly launching them at the ogre's head, creating small explosions. The ogre roared again, dispersing the fire on its face. It stopped, searching for Lucas and Isabella, who had disappeared into the road ahead. The ogre scanned the area, trying to locate them. Meanwhile, Lucas and Isabella, hiding in a small ditch, whispered to each other. Lucas, leaning against the hill, marveled at the mutant's evolution, which had given its skin and bones stronger than steel without any visible weaknesses. Isabella, frustrated, yelled at Lucas, reminding him that now wasn't the time to be impressed. Isabella suggested focusing on fire again, since the monster was so tough. Lucas glanced at her, reminding her that the ogre's skin was resistant to fire. Isabella hit her fist into her palm and asked if Lucas could use an earthquake to bury the ogre. Lucas awkwardly raised his hand, pointing out the recklessness of such an idea. The ogre knocked down yet another tree, and as it hit the ground with both hands, Lucas warned Isabella that using chaotic magic like an earthquake would attract every drake in the area. They needed to be more cautious, but with the ogre causing so much noise, it was already a risky situation. Lucas began to rise slowly, preparing to use a more effective strategy. Isabella, still sitting against the hill, asked what his plan was. The red ogre turned toward Lucas's voice as he called it his friend. Lucas raised his hand, forming multiple ice spears above him. Isabella shivered from the cold, wrapping her arms around herself. She turned to Lucas, trembling, and asked why he was using ice again if it had already failed. Lucas simply replied that only through persistence could success be achieved. Isabella exhaled, narrowing her eyes as she asked Lucas what he meant by his words. Lucas simply pointed at the ogre. All the ice spears above him aligned, targeting the massive ogre that stood before Lucas and Isabella. The ogre let out another roar, its mouth wide open, as it charged toward Lucas. Watching the approaching ogre, Lucas raised his hand and, with a calm shout, told the ogre to stop yelling and be more restrained. With 2 fingers extended as if mimicking a pistol, Lucas launched the first ice spear. It pierced the third eye on the ogre's forehead, but the creature didn't stop, continuing its mad rush toward him. As the monster drew closer, Isabella, panic-stricken, threw her arms out and shouted at Lucas about the uselessness of the spears. She pleaded with him to use another type of magic, but Lucas yelled back, telling her to shut up as he was focused. Lucas closed one eye, still aiming like he was firing a pistol. 2 more ice spears shot through the ogre's third eye. Yet, the beast continued running toward Lucas, so he launched a 4th spear, which struck the tip of the 3rd spear. Despite the attack, the ogre pushed on, waving its arms in an effort to close the gap. Lucas unleashed another ice spear that hit the end of the 4th. After 2 more spears connected, the ogre finally began to stumble, its body tipping backward. Only 1 ice spear remained above Lucas, who stood poised to deliver the final blow. The 8th and final ice spear shot toward the ogre, hitting it just as it fell to one knee. The impact sent shards of ice scattering, and the spears pierced through the monster's head, causing blood to pour from its mouth. Isabella stared in shock, her mouth wide open. Lucas casually blew on his finger like it was a gun barrel, while the ogre's body toppled backward, raising a cloud of dust. Lucas pointed at the ogre's body, using it as an example of what he meant by diligence earlier. Suddenly, the cries of creatures filled the air, making Isabella and Lucas turn to look up. A massive flock of drakes was flying directly toward them, their wings beating and roars echoing. Lucas cursed, realizing the noise from the ogre had drawn the drakes. One of the drakes opened its mouth and let out a deafening roar. Isabella, frozen in fear, glanced up as Lucas remarked that there was never a dull moment on this journey. Fire blazed down from the sky, scorching trees in its path. The drake above attacked them with its fiery breath. Lucas quickly raised his hand, using barrier magic to shield them from the flames. Off to the side, several drake bodies lay motionless, their heads pierced by Lucas's ice spears. Isabella and Lucas began to run as the drake pursued them. Isabella used her ice magic to hurl an ice arrow at the drake, but the arrow merely bounced off its armored scales. The drake stretched its neck, concentrating fire in its mouth, ready to incinerate Isabella as she fled. Suddenly, the drake's pupils contracted in pain. Lucas had leaped into the air, and using his ice magic, he drove a massive ice spear straight into the drake's neck, piercing through it. The drake's eyes met Lucas's in its final moments, the light in its gaze fading as it died. Lucas landed at the same moment the drake's body hit the ground, sending up clouds of dust. Isabella and Lucas stood before the drake's massive corpse, the smoke around it slowly clearing. As Lucas turned away, Isabella suddenly gasped in horror. Lucas turned to see what had frightened her. Towering above the trees, the Drake King loomed, smoke billowing from its mouth. Lucas and Isabella froze, staring at the enormous beast. Without hesitation, Lucas clamped a hand over Isabella's mouth, preventing her from screaming. He scooped her up into his arms and ducked behind a nearby tree, ignoring her muffled protests. Lucas set her down on the ground, signaling for her to stay quiet. The Drake King was far too powerful for them to face now, so they would have to wait for it to leave. The 2 of them remained tense, watching the Drake King roar as it searched for them. Lucas kept his gaze locked on the Drake King while Isabella trembled beside him, terrified of the massive creature. As the beast's enormous paw passed right in front of them, Lucas covered Isabella's mouth again to keep her quiet. Slowly, the Drake King began to move toward the distant mountains, leaving behind uprooted trees and disturbed earth in its wake. Once Lucas finally removed his hand, Isabella exhaled deeply, gulping in air, while Lucas kept his eyes on the retreating Drake King. Before them lay another massive footprint, left by the giant beast. After some time, the scene shifted to the mountains, near a flowing river. On the other side of the river stood a small port town. Lucas sat on a large boulder, mana continuously flowing from his body as he meditated. Isabella knelt beside him, using healing magic. A glowing circle formed around Lucas as Isabella worked, creating a gap in the mana that surrounded him. Isabella gazed at the meditating Lucas, her hair floating in the air from the powerful mana radiating from him. She exhaled softly, closing her eyes as she informed Lucas that his healing was complete. A butterfly with red-violet wings gently landed on Lucas's finger. As he looked at the delicate creature, Lucas reflected on the past 2 weeks of constant battles with monsters. Now fully in sync with his body, Lucas knew the trip to this mountain range had been more than worth it, but he still had one more matter to settle here. The butterfly on Lucas's finger took off, fluttering its wings and flying away from him. Isabella picked up her travel bag and looked back at Lucas after he called out to her. The sky was covered in dark clouds, but the peak of Drake Mountain was brightly lit. Lucas and Isabella stood gazing at the distant mountain, where Schweitzer's dungeon was located. Using wind magic, they flew toward a vast lake. Lucas, flying behind Isabella, warned her not to let her guard down, since, knowing Schweitzer's nature, he wouldn't be surprised if there were monsters lurking in that lake. Isabella glanced back at Lucas, asking how he knew Schweitzer's dungeon was there. Wind swirling around him, Lucas explained that Schweitzer had a bad habit of talking too much. As they flew over the lake, Lucas recounted Schweitzer's dream. He wanted to live atop a mountain piercing the clouds, with a stunning lake and a small island, a place of unmatched beauty. Isabella looked at Lucas, flying nearby, and asked how he knew this, but Lucas interrupted her to point out their location. They landed on a sandy beach. Isabella admired the beauty of the place, while Lucas remained focused ahead. They had landed on a picturesque island dotted with trees, and above the island, rays of sunlight painted the clouds in various colors. Isabella turned to Lucas, who was scolding Schweitzer, calling him a scoundrel. Lucas studied something on the ground. Beneath the island lay a dungeon much larger than the island itself, its shadow visible under the water. Isabella turned to Lucas, shock evident on her face. Lucas, with one hand on his hip, informed her that this island was merely the entrance to the dungeon. Isabella's eyes widened in amazement at the extravagant yet simple design of the dungeon. She glanced at Lucas, who was lost in memories of his old friend. Particles of mana glowed above the island's forest, illuminating the trees and sky. Together, Lucas and Isabella made their way through the forest filled with various plants. Soon, they stopped near a massive tree, the hollow of which resembled an archway. Isabella looked up in awe at the tree's size. It was clear that the hollow before them was the entrance. Inside, a spiral staircase wound downward, and Lucas, surprised, remarked at how Schweitzer had managed to construct such a staircase. Mana stones were embedded in the tree roots, illuminating the area. Lucas and Isabella descended the torchlit stairs. Isabella, nervously tapping her index fingers together, glanced at Lucas, walking beside her. She opened her mouth as if to ask him something, but her words faltered. She stopped herself, lowering her gaze, feeling foolish for even considering her question. Dismissing her thoughts as silly, Isabella kept quiet, her mood dropping. They continued descending in silence. The area was lit by a torch made from the light element, and Lucas and Isabella reached the depths of the dungeon. They stopped in front of a massive gate adorned with glowing patterns and stones. Isabella was amazed by the beauty of the designs. The gate stood before them, an imposing barrier. Lucas reached out, gently touching it. Isabella approached him, asking if he could open the gate. Lucas's reply made her eyes widen in fear. He explained that this gate had been created using Schweitzer's magical techniques, and if they used force, it would explode immediately. Lucas walked over to a magical orb resting on a pedestal. Brushing off the dust with his hand, he placed his palm on the orb. Inside, glowing lines began to interlace, illuminating the orb from within. A surge of magical energy erupted from the orb, tearing Lucas's shoulder fabric. Smoke began to billow from the orb, causing Isabella to back away slightly, though Lucas remained calm, observing it all. Isabella, startled by the smoke, asked what it was. The smoke gathered, condensing into a single point in space. Suddenly, Schweitzer appeared, his hands on his hips, wearing a black jumpsuit with a white cape fluttering behind him. Winking cheerfully, he began counting to 3 and then asked if he could be heard. Isabella, her lips pursed, leaned forward, trying to see Lucas's face. To her, Schweitzer seemed like a strange child, so she asked Lucas what was going on. But then her eyes widened in shock at what she saw. Lucas stood trembling before Schweitzer. Schweitzer, clapping his hands and spreading his legs, welcomed Lucas and Isabella to his dungeon. Lucas reached out with a trembling hand toward Schweitzer's face. His hand passed through Schweitzer's head, and the shaking stopped. Lucas froze, his hand still outstretched, as Isabella explained that this was just a manner-recorded greeting. She noticed Lucas tremble, amazed at Schweitzer's carefree attitude. Lucas's eyes grew misty with memories as he sadly asked Schweitzer how old he was to still act like that, noting that Schweitzer had been old for a long time. Schweitzer smiled back at Lucas, his cape still fluttering in the wind. Lucas felt a sense of comfort seeing his friend, Schweitzer. Isabella, staring at Schweitzer after hearing Lucas's words, couldn't believe that this childlike figure was Schweitzer. Crossing his arms over his chest, Schweitzer asked what they were hoping to find here and urged them to say something. Isabella, glancing at Schweitzer, realized they could communicate with him, though it was a pre-recorded message. At that moment, Lucas, with tears in his eyes, opened his mouth and called out Schweitzer's name. Schweitzer, as mana flowed from his body, chuckled and said he was only repeating what he was programmed to say, just like now. Lucas and Isabella immediately fell silent. Schweitzer crossed his arms again and, with a playful grin, told Lucas and Isabella that they would be able to claim whatever they sought, as this was his dungeon. Lucas opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but then closed it without a word. Bowing his head, Lucas asked Schweitzer, who was hovering in front of him, how he died. Schweitzer didn't answer Lucas's question but instead continued his usual remarks, stating that he wouldn't just let them into the dungeon without a challenge. They would have to answer a question first. As Schweitzer continued talking, Lucas began trembling again. Schweitzer explained that if they answered wrong, there would be no way out of the dungeon. Lucas looked at Schweitzer, who stood with arms crossed in front of him. Everything about Schweitzer, the way he spoke, his accent, was exactly the same as when they had shared joyful moments in the past. Yet now, Schweitzer's voice could no longer truly reach Lucas. Standing in the void, Lucas felt as though he had survived alone, his shadow stretching into the distance. He clenched his hand into a trembling fist, realizing that he wasn't the only one left. Lucas's mind flashed back to his battle with the demigod, where he had stood alone, surrounded by the fallen bodies of his comrades and friends. He remembered how those he loved had turned to dust over time, while those responsible for their demise still reigned in the world. Lucas's face twisted with anger and hatred as he made a vow to crush all the demigods. Isabella, standing nearby, noticed the sudden change in Lucas's demeanor. In the air, a circle of magical energy formed around Schweitzer as he posed a question to Lucas and Isabella. What about me do you hate the most? Schweitzer smiled as he asked, his golden pupils locking onto Lucas. With eyes filled with hatred, Lucas responded with a single word, demigod. Schweitzer winked and spread his arms, congratulating Lucas for giving the correct answer. As Schweitzer dissipated into smoke with a pop, the massive gate before them began to open. Lucas moved forward, while Isabella, sensing something off, hesitated. She wanted to ask Lucas something but ultimately remained silent, running to catch up with him and asking how he had known the correct answer. Lucas stopped and turned to look at Isabella, who was still trying to figure out his reasoning. She opened her mouth again to ask, but seeing the exhaustion in Lucas's eyes, she stopped. He told her not to get distracted and reminded her that this was Schweitzer's dungeon. Anything could happen. Ahead, a large arch loomed, the path to it lined with torches made of mana stones. Schweitzer's style had always been unpredictable, and Lucas knew there could be traps waiting for them. As Lucas walked, scolding Isabella for being absent-minded, she stood behind, observing him. If she truly wanted to become stronger, she would have to cast aside all distractions and focus. Her face flushed slightly as she followed Lucas once more. They walked up the stairs, gazing at the arch ahead. Lucas suggested they check the vestibule before continuing. In front of them stood two enormous stone golems, their heads adorned with green stones. These golems flanked another gate, and Lucas stepped forward, placing his hand on a magic ball. A stream of mana began to flow from it, and, just like before, smoke filled the air. Lucas stood to the side, watching intently. A slightly older version of Schweitzer appeared, his hands raised in the air. Isabella noticed the difference and remarked that this time Schweitzer appeared as a teenager. Lucas agreed, noting that Schweitzer seemed to grow older each time they crossed a threshold in the dungeon. Schweitzer, standing before them, announced the second question. Lucas, irritated, asked why they had to answer another question, but Schweitzer didn't respond directly, launching into a lengthy explanation. With the golems standing motionless in the background, Schweitzer informed them that the deeper they went, the more amazing treasures they could find. However, they were only allowed to take one item. If they broke this rule, the golems would awaken and attack. Schweitzer pointed at Lucas, warning him that even one mistake would mean immediate elimination. Lucas's eyes widened as Schweitzer mentioned a familiar name, Iris Fistbun. Schweitzer crossed his arms and began complaining about Iris, saying he could never understand what went through her mind. Lucas and Isabella listened, and Schweitzer continued talking about their efforts to save the world. Regardless of the chaos, Iris always seemed preoccupied with thoughts of men. Isabella turned to Lucas, asking about Iris, also known as the Black Witch. Lucas's expression darkened with memories, his eyes full of sorrow as he recalled a woman with jet-black hair and a mysterious smile. Iris, known as the Black Witch, was unlike any woman he had ever met. A faint smile crept onto Lucas's face, and drool trickled from the corner of his lips as he reminisced about her. Isabella watched him with a strange look. Suddenly, Lucas snapped out of it when Schweitzer mentioned that he hated Lucas even more than Iris. With one hand on his hip, Schweitzer went on to talk about Iris's unrequited love, which Lucas, for some reason, never noticed. Lucas's face turned red, and he asked in shock if Schweitzer's words were true. Schweitzer laughed, repeating his statement. Lucas grew angrier as Schweitzer compared his intelligence to that of the golem behind him, while Isabella pondered the strange similarities between Lucas and Schweitzer. Finally, Schweitzer posed his question, describing a demon with 6 arms and 3 faces, one of the powerful beings Iris had once served. Schweitzer raised his finger, continuing his description, but Lucas interrupted him, shouting the name, Azura. Instantly, Schweitzer's body dissolved into smoke, and the gate opened. Lucas immediately walked through, while Isabella stood, surprised by how quickly he had answered. Inside, the room was filled with various jewelry and artifacts. 2 items lay side by side. A box containing a golden necklace adorned with red rubies, and a steel arm covered in various gems. The entire room was adorned with decorations, jewels, and ancient artifacts. Soon, Lucas and Isabella arrived at the next gate, where they saw Schweitzer standing before them. An adult Schweitzer, appearing to be in his 40s, stood directly in front of them, ready to ask the next question. Isabella touched her chin, noticing Schweitzer's more mature appearance. Lucas observed Schweitzer, confirming his suspicion that the deeper they ventured into the dungeon, the more mature Schweitzer appeared. They stood before him, with a stone golem kneeling beside them, and Lucas reflected on how this dungeon seemed to be Schweitzer's personal diary. Looking directly at Schweitzer, Lucas asked why he had created this place. What was Schweitzer trying to convey, and to whom? Shortly after Lucas voiced the question, the gate slowly began to open, accompanied by clouds of smoke. Schweitzer, now more mature, confirmed the truth of Lucas's answer as the gate creaked open. Lucas and Isabella passed through the gate into the next room. As they walked, Isabella admired Lucas for his quick thinking, as this was now the 5th room they had entered. Lucas, stroking his chin, pondered how the questions seemed to deviate more and more from magic the further they advanced. Isabella, walking behind him, marveled at how Lucas always seemed to have the right answers. They continued until they arrived at another chamber, where Schweitzer, now with a gray beard, stood waiting. Schweitzer, leaning on a staff and wearing a white robe, announced that this was the final room. Lucas was shocked at the sight of Schweitzer, who now appeared as an elderly man with a long gray beard. Schweitzer, leaning on his staff, addressed Lucas by his full name, Lucas Troman. Lucas, wide-eyed and speechless, stared at Schweitzer. Slowly, Schweitzer's body began to dissolve into particles of mana, but before vanishing, he spoke of Fry, calling him an archmage who had risen to greatness by the age of 40, a teacher to all of humanity, and a friend who had been the greatest pride and joy of Schweitzer's life. Isabella, watching Lucas, was stunned as Lucas's body trembled, his eyes welling with tears. Lucas, his voice full of emotion, responded, saying that it was a great pride and joy for him as well to have been friends with someone like Schweitzer. Isabella, still in shock, watched Lucas, not fully grasping what was happening. Schweitzer, resting his hands on his 3-headed staff adorned with jewels, smiled and asked his final question. "Tell me my real name." Lucas stood still, his face hidden in shadow, deep in thought. Each question had become more mysterious, and Lucas realized that they were designed in such a way that only he could answer them. Lucas looked away, then softly spoke Schweitzer's real name, Schweitzer Weissman. Isabella turned sharply, shocked to learn that Schweitzer's real name was not Straw, but Weissman. A faint smile appeared on Schweitzer's lips as his body began to dissolve once more, turning into streams of mana. Schweitzer's final words were directed at Lucas, telling him to enter the gate because everything had been prepared for him. Lucas's pupils widened, and he called out for Schweitzer to stop. But Schweitzer, smiling, simply told Lucas to come back soon as he vanished completely into smoke. Lucas stood with his arm outstretched, desperately reaching for Schweitzer, but it was too late. Schweitzer had fully dissolved, leaving Lucas trembling with grief and sadness. Mana began to pour from Lucas's body as he stood frozen, overwhelmed by the loss of his friend. Isabella, watching from behind, finally realized something important. Schweitzer had called Lucas by his true name, Lucas. Lucas and Isabella moved forward, opening the wooden door before them. They entered the final room of the dungeon, where a table piled with books and a burning candle sat in the center. While Lucas, now deeply focused, moved toward the chest in the room, Isabella stopped near the table. Gazing at the candle, she noted that unlike the other rooms, this one felt alive. Her eyes widened in surprise as she turned toward Lucas, who was rummaging through the chest. With joy in his voice, he announced that he had found something interesting. Holding a small bottle of liquid in his hand, Lucas was immediately asked by Isabella what it was. Continuing to examine the bottle with excitement, Lucas explained that it contained the legendary Ice River, a revelation that left Isabella in confusion. Isabella shared her knowledge, saying that the Ice River was a legendary oil, a drop of which could only be found in underground caves once every 1,000 years. The potion was said to grant an extraordinary leap in power, allowing even an ordinary person to reach the level of 4 stars in a short time. Lucas, impressed by her knowledge, looked at Isabella with a smile, pleased by her insight. Isabella, impatient and intrigued, reached for the bottle and exclaimed in shock, admitting that she had always thought the Ice River was a mere myth. Lucas, watching her excitement, found her reaction amusing. Still holding the flask of potion, Lucas looked at it with satisfaction, remarking that he needed it to reach the level of 7 stars. Meanwhile, Isabella was crouching beside the open chest, sorting through its contents. Understanding why Lucas had come to the dungeon, she hugged her bent knees with one arm and pulled out 2 miniature turquoise earrings from a small wooden box, examining them with curiosity. Noticing her, Lucas cast a concerned glance in her direction. Realizing she was holding glowing earrings, Isabella concluded that their design was rather tacky. As she squatted and tried on the jewelry, Lucas suddenly swore at Schweitzer for leaving something so insignificant in the final room of the dungeon. Isabella looked at Lucas in bewilderment, her mind still processing everything they had found. Closing one eye and scratching the back of his head, Lucas, now inhabiting Frey's body, admitted that the earrings were clip-ons, ones he had made himself. Isabella's mouth fell open in surprise. Frey stared intently at her as she questioned how something he made could end up in Schweitzer's dungeon. With a smile, Lucas confessed that he had made those earrings 4,000 years ago out of boredom and had later given them to Schweitzer. Isabella, standing behind him, was taken aback by this revelation, her mouth agape in shock. Lucas noted that he hadn't realized how much those earrings must have meant to Schweitzer for him to keep them in the dungeon. Isabella soon composed herself, covering her mouth as her expression grew more serious. She turned to Lucas and asked him to explain everything in more detail. Lucas paused, looking at her with some hesitation before speaking. When he finally did, Isabella's eyes widened once again. Lucas hesitated, then admitted something that left her stunned. He was not really Frey but Lucas Troman. Taken aback, Isabella stood frozen in shock as Lucas began explaining how he had fought against the demigod lord for 4,000 years alongside Schweitzer, spending all that time in the darkness of the underworld. Lucas, in Frey's body, explained that after enduring countless trials, the darkness eventually receded. He recalled how, after hearing a voice, he had been freed from the grip of the monsters in the underworld. It was Frey Blake's voice, and when Lucas answered his call, their minds had synchronized. He wasn't sure why Frey, injured and coughing up blood, had called out to him so desperately or how their minds had connected at that moment. But somehow, Lucas had taken over Frey's body. Now, standing with his hand on his chest, Lucas confessed to Isabella that his current body once belonged to Frey. Isabella gazed at him with a piercing look, seeing him as an entirely different person now. After taking it all in, she closed her eyes sadly, lowering her head. Lucas, noticing how her mood suddenly fell, watched her with concern, unsure of what to say. Scratching his cheek, he admitted with a perplexed expression that he had expected her not to believe him. Isabella, however, replied that while the situation was absurd, it made a strange kind of sense. She smiled while holding the earrings and concluded that the man in front of her was indeed Lucas Troman. With that realization, Isabella dropped to one knee in front of him and respectfully held out the earrings in her palms, bowing her head in greeting. The main character, illuminated by the light in the room, carefully took the turquoise triangles from her hands, the very earrings he had crafted so long ago. Then, in a sudden move, Lucas sat down beside Isabella, bringing himself to her level, and asked her to continue calling him Frey, as it would make things easier for him to achieve his goals. Leaning closer, Lucas whispered, with a dissatisfied look, asking why she was suddenly acting so formal. He teased her, saying this pretentious atmosphere was giving him a rash. Isabella, embarrassed, averted her gaze. She glanced at the candle on the table, which continued to burn brightly, casting light across the room. Sitting down next to the lit lamp, Lucas curiously examined the turquoise earrings in his hand. He turned to Isabella, who was still rummaging through the chest, and teasingly recalled her earlier comment about the earrings' tasteless design. Isabella, pretending not to hear him, pulled out a bracelet and, assuming it was another piece of Frey's work, began praising its stylish appearance. Lucas, however, told her that the bracelet had been made by Schweitzer, causing Isabella to freeze with embarrassment. Still holding the bracelet, Isabella was shocked when Lucas informed her that the accessory was, in fact, the staff of the great sage Schweitzer, used for his alter ego. She was astonished by the revelation. Rising from his seat and walking toward her, Lucas asked for the bracelet so he could demonstrate its power, noting that it could drain her mana. She quickly agreed and handed the bracelet over to him. Lucas fastened the bracelet around his scarred hand and then put the turquoise earrings on his ears. A powerful whirlwind of mana surged around him, his long hair swaying in the energy. Isabella watched him with admiration. With a fascinated smile, Isabella was captivated by the massive surge of mana, but accidentally called Lucas Luker, mixing up his name. Lucas, confused, had no idea who she was referring to. Holding his hand with the bracelet in his palm, Lucas admitted that using magical artifacts wasn't really his style, but this was something precious that belonged to his friend. Meanwhile, Isabella, still rummaging through the chest, discovered a new item and, with curiosity, asked Lucas what it was. Holding a metal ball with a red core delicately between two fingers, she assumed it was a golem core, noting the concentrated mana within it. Lucas quickly took the artifact from her hands and, closing his eyes, warned her to be more careful with it, explaining that this ball was the last of its kind. His attention then shifted to the room around them, eventually landing on Schweitzer's desk. His eyes were drawn to a candle that never went out, thanks to the power of mana. Smiling to himself, Lucas noted that Schweitzer had always been a fan of such whimsical creations. As he reminisced, keeping his hand on the table, Isabella commented that she could still feel Schweitzer's warm spirit, as if he were welcoming them, as if the old man were alive and close by. Lucas, feeling a bit nostalgic, timidly opened a diary that lay on the desk. Inside, a bookmark marked a particular page. When Lucas saw the note written in crooked handwriting, his expression turned to one of shock. The note read, "Lucas has disappeared." Fry read the next page, where Schweitzer hinted that the Lord might have been involved in Lucas's disappearance. Panic washed over Fry as he stared at the page, which stated that no one but the Lord could have made Lucas vanish without a trace. Behind him, Isabella stood with wide, round eyes. Schweitzer's diary expressed his deep sorrow over the loss of the 9-star mage, whose disappearance symbolized the vanishing of humanity's last hope. As Fry continued reading, the diary recorded events following Lucas's disappearance, including the conflict between the warrior Kasigen and the swordmaster Rushid. It also mentioned the sudden disappearance of the witch Iris. Schweitzer noted how the demigod's influence had deeply penetrated the continent, leaving him unable to trust anyone around him. The people around Schweitzer donned masks of admiration while secretly monitoring the situation, waiting for an opportune moment to pounce and eliminate him. The diary chronicled Schweitzer's fierce daily battles against the monsters his peers had become. Fry, bending over the diary, read with a deep sadness about how his friend had fought alone, and Isabella, standing behind him, covered her mouth in horror. One of the pages described Lucas as an independent figure, someone irreplaceable. The next page contained a note on how Schweitzer had tried to bear the burden but, with each passing second, felt his mana draining. As Fry continued reading, Schweitzer asked for Lucas's forgiveness, and upon seeing these words, Isabella began to cry in shock. Fry could vividly imagine Schweitzer sitting at the very desk before him, writing these words of apology for being too weak to carry the mantle alone. Grief-stricken, Fry placed a trembling fist on the pages of the diary. His lips quivered as he whispered that Schweitzer had been so lonely all this time. Tears welled up in his eyes. The saddened Isabella softly called out to Fry, but he didn't look up. Flipping through the diary, Fry came to a painful realization. Now that he too was left alone, he finally understood what Schweitzer had endured. Running his fingers over the lines, Fry promised that, along with Schweitzer's loneliness, he would also inherit his will. With tear-streaked eyes, Fry lifted his gaze to the heavens and, addressing his fallen friend, vowed that he would smash the demigod's head. After those words, Fry clenched his fists and began walking away from the desk. Isabella, watching with a knowing look, bent over the diary herself. Suddenly, something caught her attention, and she sharply called out to Fry. When he turned around in confusion, Isabella pointed out that there was more written in the diary. Fry read the passage aloud. It was a request for anyone reading the diary to complete Anastasia. Isabella quoted Schweitzer's claim that Anastasia was his greatest masterpiece. While Fry rummaged through a bag, seemingly preoccupied, Isabella turned to him and asked who or what Anastasia could be. Taking out the ball with the red core, Fry examined it carefully, and Isabella followed his lead. The name Anastasia was engraved on the metal casing, written in Punic symbols. Crystals on the dungeon walls sparkled like lanterns as Isabella and Fry walked up the illuminated stairs. Isabella speculated that the stone was the core of a golem. Fry, a few steps ahead, confirmed that Schweitzer had been a skilled puppeteer, and he couldn't even begin to imagine the power Anastasia might hold. Hearing this, Isabella raised her astonished gaze toward him. Leaning against the wall, Isabella suggested that perhaps Fry could complete the golem with the core. Frey's face contorted in dissatisfaction, and Isabella immediately asked what was wrong. Frey's memories flashed back to a time when he had shown Schweitzer his first golem, a failed creation. Schweitzer had burst into loud laughter, pointing at the ridiculous creature, asking Lucas never to make a golem again. Lucas, at the time, had defensively called it an avant-garde cubist design, but Schweitzer couldn't stop laughing. In the memory, Schweitzer, holding his stomach and wiping away tears, had promised that next time, he would build the golem himself, as it would surely turn out better. A frustrated Lucas, then younger, had shot a fireball at Schweitzer, sending him flying. These warm, albeit embarrassing, memories flashed through Frey's mind, and he began to tremble slightly. Isabella, concerned, noticed his behavior and called out to him. Fry, still holding the golem core, muttered that once they completed everything, they would uncover the unrecorded history hidden in the gaps. Isabella, standing behind him with her mouth open in bewilderment, repeated his words, unsure of what to make of them. As they ascended toward the dungeon's exit, where sunlight streamed in more brightly with every step, Fry suddenly froze. Isabella, following closely behind, stopped as well and asked, with growing concern, if something was wrong again. Gritting his teeth, Fry growled that once they left the dungeon, Isabella should return to the city immediately. She looked taken aback by the sudden shift in his demeanor. In the blue sky above, many dragons floated, resembling massive birds in the distance. Fry and Isabella emerged from the dungeon, standing at the edge of a stone cliff. As Isabella scanned the sky, she trembled when she noticed something enormous. Perched on a nearby rock was a formidable dragon of colossal size, its eyes glowing fiercely, its sharp teeth bared. Fry calmly asked the creature if it had been waiting for him. The Drake King responded with a furious glare, exhaling hot steam from its toothy maw. As Lucas and Isabella climbed to the mountain's summit, where even more dragons flew behind the Drake King, Lucas furiously asked again if the creature had been expecting him. Lucas, looking at the Drake King, remarked that he knew the dragon had intelligence and demanded it speak. The dragon glared back at Lucas and, narrowing its eyes, mockingly stated that Lucas was amusing. Letting out a roar, the Drake King declared that he had indeed been waiting for Lucas and questioned how the mage dared to enter the kingdom of Torqued without fear. Lucas glared at the dragon, demanding to know why it had pretended not to see them earlier in the forest and had simply walked past. Isabella, watching Lucas, noticed that his voice was trembling, something she had never seen in him before. The Drake King opened its massive mouth and groaned, stating that it had been watching Lucas and was merely waiting for him to emerge from the cave beneath the tallest tree. The dragon went on to say that the boy who ventured into the dungeon had something valuable. Lucas's expression hardened as he remembered the rarest potion, the Ice River, whose ingredients appeared only once every 1,000 years. He realized why the dragon had become so brazen. It had been hunting people near the dungeon. At that moment, the Drake King flapped its enormous wings. Lucas clenched his fist, furious at the thought that the dungeon Schweitzer treasured so deeply had been turned into a trap by the Drake King, used merely to fill his belly. Lucas's eyes glowed a bright blue as he angrily declared that the Drake King needed to be punished. The dragon's expression shifted in surprise. In its thoughts, the dragon recognized the look in Lucas's eyes. It was the same look the dragon had seen before in a girl, a black-haired girl with violet eyes, who had once warned the Drake King to stay put. She had extended her palm to the dragon and threatened that if it followed her, she would kill it. Recalling that memory, the Drake King told Lucas that he didn't like the way he looked at him. Confidently, Lucas told Isabella to run, but the frightened girl hesitated. Shouting, Lucas told her he wasn't sure he could handle the fight this time, insisting that she needed to run. Isabella, yelling back, refused to leave him behind. The dragon gathered a massive fireball in its mouth, declaring that the two of them looked delicious. As the dragon flew toward Lucas with the fireball in its mouth, it declared that it would devour them both. Lucas extended his hand, and magical artifacts materialized before him. Among them was Schweitzer's staff. Lucas gripped the staff tightly and swung it toward the dragon. Streams of aura emanated from the magical weapon, and Lucas summoned a stone wall, which flew straight into the Drake King's head. The dragon grunted in pain. Glancing at Isabella, Lucas shouted, asking if she was missing the point of the situation. With a fierce look, he told her to stop getting in the way and called her an insect. Isabella's expression immediately shifted, offended and upset by the remark. Gritting her teeth, she froze momentarily before shouting back at Lucas, promising that she would return soon, and then ran away. The Drake King, with the fireball still in its mouth, taunted Lucas, saying he was a daring man. Then, with a mighty breath, the dragon unleashed its fiery power toward him. The fireball struck Lucas, and the shockwave sent him flying. Even in midair, Lucas's expression remained serious as he faced the dragon. Using Schweitzer's staff, Lucas flew through the air, dodging the Drake King's next attack, a colossal fireball. The fireball's explosion shattered the stones below, but Lucas deftly pushed off one of the stones and flew in the opposite direction of the dragon's attack. His face was battle-hardened and determined. As other dragons began to converge on Lucas, he clicked his tongue loudly. His triangular earring began to glow, and the tip of Schweitzer's staff illuminated as well. Pointing the staff at the approaching dragons, Lucas summoned ice spears, which flew at them with incredible speed. After that, Lucas extended his hand and conjured a stormy wind, channeling a powerful magical attack. The dragons were caught off guard as the storm wind beam surged toward them, striking them with raw magical energy. The most powerful part of the beam passed through the dragons, and in a single devastating attack, a dozen of them were defeated. Inside the beam, Lucas himself flew with fierce determination. In his thoughts, Lucas acknowledged that he would have to fend off these dragons for a long time. As the Drake King flew toward him, Lucas thought grimly that until he eliminated this dragon, the fight wouldn't end. Preparing for the next strike, Lucas tilted his staff and got ready to face the oncoming dragon. Forming a magical seal in the air, Lucas calculated the dragon's speed and direction. A countdown from the magic seal appeared, giving Lucas a critical 3-second window before the explosion. The Drake King approached the magical seal, its mouth wide open and ready to strike. With his eyes wide, Lucas shouted, issuing a command to trigger the explosion. The seal detonated beneath the dragon, stunning it and sending it plummeting toward the ground. Lucas watched the dragon fall, groaning in pain, but before long, the Drake King flapped its wings and dispelled the fire around it. The dragon grinned at Lucas, impressed, declaring that calculating its speed so precisely was no easy feat. However, the Drake King smirked and taunted Lucas, saying that while his approach was good, he lacked the strength needed to defeat him. The dragon, calling Lucas an annoying insect, swung its massive tail and struck him. Lucas, holding Schweitzer's staff tightly, admitted to himself that the dragon was far too massive to handle easily. In his thoughts, he reminded himself that the Drake King, Torquata, stood before him with smaller dragons flying behind. As he flew through the air, Lucas realized that this was a dilemma, and there seemed to be no easy way out. Narrowing his eyes, he considered the ice river potion he had obtained from Schweitzer. He remembered a conversation he'd had with Isabella, where she had asked if he intended to drink the nourishing tonic. Lucas had held the small bottle in his hand, explaining that it would take a week to stabilize the potion's energy. Walking down a long corridor, he had told Isabella they couldn't stay there without water and food, and she had agreed. Now, in the midst of battle, Lucas fought off the smaller dragons, but in his thoughts, he refused to take the tonic. Drinking it now would be suicide. Pushing himself away from the dragons with a powerful magical beam, Lucas flew a little farther from them, glancing behind to see if they were still chasing him. As he turned his head forward again, Lucas was suddenly shocked. A dragon appeared directly in front of him, its mouth wide open, ready to strike. Lucas instinctively raised Schweitzer's staff to defend himself as the dragon lunged at him with its jaws wide open. But before the dragon could strike, a powerful magical beam flew into its side, knocking it off course. Stunned, Lucas tried to make sense of what had happened. His gaze shifted to a fiery bird in the sky, a majestic phoenix. The bird gripped one dragon by the neck with its beak and another with its talons. Lucas smiled, recognizing the bird instantly, and declared with relief, "It's a phoenix." The phoenix, with its fiery wings outstretched, squeezed the dragons tightly, causing them to screech in pain. Its magical flames enveloped the dragons, and moments later, they were ablaze, falling lifelessly to the ground. Lucas beamed, relieved that the phoenix was still alive and well. The phoenix, in turn, seemed glad to see Lucas, as if their bond from long ago had not faded. Torquato, the Drake King, watched the phoenix with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "What now?" he grumbled. "Another nuisance." He shrugged off the phoenix, believing it to be inconsequential. Lucas clenched his fist at the dragon's dismissive attitude. As Torquato flew toward them, Lucas quickly ordered the phoenix to fly away, warning that the bird couldn't handle this foe. But the phoenix ignored Lucas's words and instead gathered all its magical energy, preparing to confront the Drake King head-on. The phoenix unleashed a powerful magical strike at Torquato, but the dragon barely flinched. "That tickles," the dragon mocked. Panic surged through Lucas, and he shouted for the phoenix to stop, reminding it that the Drake King was immune to fire. Watching the phoenix struggle, Lucas grew more desperate, shouting at the bird to retreat. But the phoenix remained resolute, continuing to battle Torquato. Despite Lucas's pleas, the phoenix glanced back at him with a determined look, its fiery eyes giving Lucas a knowing glance. It wasn't retreating. It was buying time for Lucas. The bird lunged at the dragon again, firing another massive beam of fire, but once again, the attack did little to harm Torquato. In his thoughts, Lucas realized the phoenix was telling him to escape, to save himself. Lucas's heart sank as he bowed his head, admitting in his thoughts that he felt utterly helpless. His body trembled with fear. He questioned whether his weakness came from inhabiting someone else's body, or from having been returned to the world after 4,000 years. But he knew the answer. It wasn't just his body or his return. It was his lack of resolve. Apologizing to the phoenix in his mind, Lucas decided to retreat and learn from the bird's courage. Lucas flew away from the battle, heading back into the dungeon. As he landed inside the familiar, dimly lit cavern, he silently thanked the phoenix for the time it had bought him. His mind was racing. He couldn't allow himself to be weak any longer. Taking out the bottle containing the ice river potion, Lucas realized that his current life was just another chapter in his long journey, and now he had to face the consequences. Opening the bottle, Lucas drank the potion, knowing it would come with immense pain. He whispered to himself that Phoenix would give him the time he needed to transform. As the liquid coursed through his body, he dropped the empty vial to the ground and fell to his knees. His hands raised before him as he struggled to contain the overwhelming energy of the ice river. His hair stood on end, and grunts of pain escaped him as his entire body surged with power. Lucas's eyes turned a brilliant blue, and despite his best efforts, The intensity of the transformation caused him to scream throughout the dungeon. Blood began to pour from Lucas's nose and mouth, and a powerful magical aura enveloped him, creating shockwaves that echoed through the stone walls. The force of the magic was so intense that Lucas slammed his fist into the ground, causing the dungeon floor to quake beneath him. His body was trembling, but he continued to scream, pushing himself through the agonizing process. Meanwhile, the battle between the Phoenix and Torquata raged on. Phoenix let out a piercing scream, but the Drake King laughed in response. "You know each other, don't you?" Torquata sneered. "This is a lucky day for me." The dragon shifted his focus, declaring that while Lucas was a formidable opponent, the life force of the Phoenix was far more valuable. The Phoenix, exhausted and battered, fell to the ground with a groan. Torquata, perching on a nearby rock, smugly claimed that the bird had no strength left. "Surrender and become my meal," the dragon taunted. The weakened Phoenix lay motionless, struggling to even scream, but in a final act of defiance, it summoned the last of its strength and let out a loud cry. Suddenly, an explosion of fire erupted where the Phoenix lay, startling the Drake King. "What's this?" Torquata muttered, approaching the fire. He flapped his wings, blowing the flames aside, but the Phoenix had vanished. Frustrated, the dragon sneered, calling the bird a rat for escaping. "There's no rush," Torquata growled. "As long as you're in the Spain Mountains, you can't escape me. We'll meet again." In the forest below, the Phoenix crash-landed, groaning as it struggled to move. The strength was completely drained. The bird collapsed near a beautiful waterfall, groaning softly as it tried to catch its breath. But then, Lucas appeared, placing his hand on the Phoenix's head. "You must have fought a strong opponent," he said softly. The Phoenix groaned, closing its eyes. Lucas, feeling a wave of nostalgia, reassured the bird. "It's okay now. I'll help you." He placed both hands on the Phoenix's head, and a warm magical aura enveloped them both. As the energy swirled around them, Lucas smiled, remembering the old times he had shared with his friend. The Phoenix, recognizing Lucas's touch, slowly opened its eyes, and its green gaze met his. "Lucas," his voice soft but firm, said, "My old friend." The Phoenix's eyes shimmered with light as it began to regain its strength. Its fiery spirit reignited. The bond between them was as strong as ever. The battle continued with fierce intensity as the fiery bird, Phoenix, darted toward the low-flying dragon. With a piercing cry, it struck Torquata's back with its talons, catching the massive dragon off guard. Surprised, Torquata swung his powerful tail in retaliation, calling the Phoenix a pathetic insect. The tail struck Phoenix hard, causing the bird to open its beak in pain. Meanwhile, back in the cave, Lucas was struggling. Huge flows of ice had begun to form around him as he fought the overwhelming power of the Ice River potion. His body was slowly icing over as he gritted his teeth and, in his thoughts, acknowledged that he had made a decision but hadn't anticipated it being this difficult. He lowered his hand to the ground, mentally apologizing to Schweitzer. Lucas admitted that his arrogance had turned his regained life into a soap bubble, a fragile existence that now felt like it could shatter at any moment. The ice continued to spread around him as Lucas fell to the ground. He could feel his strength draining, and his mind swirled with thoughts of failure. Was it physical exhaustion or his lack of determination that caused him to falter? In the darkness of his despair, Lucas heard a voice, feeling warmth return to his body. When he opened his eyes, he saw Isabella by his side, her hands glowing with a warm aura as she tended to him. "What are you doing here?" Lucas managed to ask. Isabella, with a soft but firm voice, told him to stay still. His recovery wasn't complete yet. Lucas noticed the food she had brought and remembered how he had said that nourishment was key to digesting the Ice River potion. Looking into Isabella's eyes, Lucas asked if she had gone to the city. Isabella, looking at his frozen face, reminded him that he had once said he felt alone. And now, standing by his side, she understood that sentiment. She reassured Lucas that she believed in him, even though she didn't fully grasp what he was striving to achieve in this world. Closing her eyes as she continued warming him, Isabella told Lucas that she didn't want to hear any more talk about him being alone. Lucas let out a small laugh, admitting that he wasn't great at taking care of himself. He smiled and thanked Isabella. As he lay there, Lucas turned his thoughts back to Schweitzer, realizing that what he had been missing all this time wasn't determination or strength. It was trust in the people around him. Feeling a newfound clarity, Lucas began to rise into the air. His thoughts focused on the trust he had in Isabella and his other allies. Meanwhile, the battle outside had momentarily paused. Torquata's attention was drawn toward the cave as he sensed the cold emanating from it. His eyes narrowed as he wondered what kind of power was brewing within. Before he could react, Phoenix took advantage of the distraction and struck the dragon directly in the eye with its beak. Torquata let out a roar of pain, turning toward Phoenix with a bloody eye. "How dare you, bird!" he bellowed, quickly snapping his jaws around Phoenix's neck. The bird squealed in pain as Torquata lifted it into the air, then violently slammed it to the ground. "How dare you strike me, the mighty Torquata, in the eye?" the dragon growled. The phoenix groaned from the impact, but it wasn't done yet. Torquata, seeing the bird's defiance, mocked it, calling it a damned little thing and demanding that it die already. Phoenix, however, continued to taunt the dragon, much to Torquata's irritation. Raising his wings, Torquata flew upward, shouting that he would kill the phoenix. But just as the dragon prepared to strike again, a powerful magical beam shot from the cave, aimed directly at him. Torquata, stunned by the sudden attack, flapped his wings in confusion and managed to dodge the beam at the last moment. What was that? The dragon wondered, his expression full of bewilderment. Then, from the cave, a second, even more powerful magical beam shot forth. The smaller dragons that had been flying nearby were caught in its icy wake, instantly frozen in place. Their carcasses fell to the ground, shattering upon impact. Shards of ice sparkled in the distance as a brilliant light accompanied the attack. Torquata, flying through the debris, felt something he hadn't experienced in 1,000 years: fear. The Drake King's instincts screamed at him to flee. As he flew, his thoughts raced. This can't be happening. I am Torquata, king of the drakes. I cannot be afraid of a mere human. But despite his bravado, the dragon's heart pounded with anxiety. Suddenly, Lucas emerged from the cave, surrounded by a powerful magical aura. In his thoughts, Torquata asked himself, is this fear? With lightning speed, the dragon took off, trying to escape from Lucas. But before he could get far, Lucas teleported directly in front of him, cutting off his escape route. With a confident expression, Lucas said in his thoughts that Torquata's injured eye meant he couldn't keep up. The dragon, noticing Lucas's sudden appearance, was confused. How did he catch up to me? Torquata wondered, disbelief etched on his face. Lucas summoned ice spears and sent them hurtling toward the Drake King. The spears struck Torquata's chest, causing him to roar in pain. Some of the spears pierced deeply into his flesh, and blood poured from the wounds. Gritting his teeth, Torquata spread his wings and managed to rip the spears from his chest, glaring at Lucas. You're just a man, the dragon growled. Torqu's one good eye narrowed as he searched for Lucas, but to his surprise, the hero had teleported again, disappearing from his line of sight. Torquata, frustrated, questioned how Lucas could have disappeared so quickly. But Lucas, observing the dragon's confusion from his new position, simply thought to himself that Torquata, despite being 1,000 years old, was still arrogant and relied too much on his sight. With a calm yet fierce resolve, Lucas prepared for the final strike. This battle would not last much longer. The Drake King, Torquata, could sense Lucas moving closer to his blind spot. His thoughts raced as he realized Lucas was already near his wounded, bloodied eye. Before Torquata could react, Lucas summoned a single ice spear and hurled it toward the dragon's vulnerable spot. The spear struck true, embedding itself deep into the injured eye, causing Torquata to grunt and roar in excruciating pain. The mighty dragon, plummeting from the sky, screamed in agony and furiously lashed out at Lucas, calling him a pathetic worm. As the dragon writhed in the air, there was a powerful explosion behind him, sending shockwaves through the air. From the debris of the explosion, a magical projectile shot toward the Drake King, followed swiftly by a second blast. Even amidst the chaos, Torquato couldn't stop mocking Lucas, but a sudden realization hit him, a sense of impending doom. As he looked toward the tip of his tail, he saw a block of ice forming, a telltale sign of Lucas's relentless assault. A strange sound echoed from the stone debris scattered around the battlefield. From within the wreckage, Lucas emerged, his silhouette cutting through the haze of ice and destruction. Torquato, stunned by the resilience of the human, turned to face his adversary. The dragon's mind raced, questioning whether Lucas could truly be human, given the raw power and determination he displayed. Fry, the man whose body Lucas now occupied, stood with mana surging around him like a raging storm. The air around him crackled with magical energy, his presence overwhelming. Torquato lifted his head, his mouth open in fear, and asked Fry what kind of being he was. From the sidelines, Isabella watched as Torquato soared into the sky before Fry, the flapping of his wings sending clouds of dust into the air. Isabella gazed at their battle in awe. Fry, with mana pouring out of him in a turbulent stream, looked as though he could collapse at any moment, and it wouldn't be surprising given how long he had been maintaining such a dangerous state. Fry lifted his hand, summoning a massive ice spear above him. Lucas's eyes glowed as he fixed his gaze on Torquato. Torquato's eye also glimmered, flames flickering around his head, as he marveled at the immense amount of energy Fry was unleashing. He asked Fry if he was truly so desperate to defeat him. Torquato began gathering fire in his mouth. He glanced at Fry, whose hand was raised toward the sky. Torquato wasn't sure what had changed about him, but he couldn't accept that his fiery breath would be ineffective against him, especially since even the phoenix had fallen before his might. Shouting that it was the end for Fry, Torquato released his fiery breath toward him. Fry lowered his hand, pointing it toward Torquato. The enormous ice spear clashed with the drake's fiery breath, generating powerful gusts of wind. Isabella crossed her arms in front of her face to shield herself from the shockwave created by the collision. She opened one eye, astonished by the force of the blow, which shook the entire mountain range. Fire and ice battled in the air, an incredible spectacle as the collision cleared all the dust and bathed the mountains in bright rays of light. The entire range trembled from the raw power of the magical duel. Flames continued to pour from Torquato's mouth as he relentlessly tried to overpower Fry. The drake's breath and Frey's spell struggled fiercely against one another, sending gusts of wind spiraling from the clash. Torquato's flames gradually gained the upper hand, pushing against Frey's ice. Isabella gasped in fear as she watched Fry start to falter. She wasn't sure what they would do if he lost. Torquato, hovering in the air, maintained the onslaught, overwhelming Frey's ice spear. At that moment, Isabella realized she couldn't offer any help. But then she spotted something. A magic circle behind the ice spear, feeding it with mana, while Fry himself had vanished. Torquato, still suspended in the sky, taunted Fry, mocking him for soon falling before him, certain that no human could surpass his might. However, his words were cut short as the pupils in his eyes vanished. Isabella, struck by a cold wind, noticed something strange and shouted. The drake's head had been severed, leaving a trail of mana from an ice spell in its wake. Fry, holding his spell in his hand, hovered in the air directly above the Drake King. He had used ice magic to form a massive ice scythe that had cleaved Torquato's head from his neck. The drake's body and head plummeted to the ground in two separate directions. Mana still radiated from the point of impact. Isabella flew up and saw the enormous body and head of Torquato crash to the earth, shattering the ground and raising thick clouds of smoke. Their fall was like an explosion that shook the surrounding area. Isabella approached Torquato's body, halting in disbelief. She was astonished to realize that Fry had been behind Torquato the entire time. Hovering in the air, she looked down at the enormous head of Torquato, cracks forming in the ground beneath it. It was now clear. The 1,000-year-old king of the drakes had fallen at Frey's hands. Gazing at Frey floating in the air, Isabella wondered, if Frey had fought at half-strength, what could Lucas Trauman's true power be? Frey's body wavered and began to lean forward, prompting Isabella to cry out in alarm. Frey collapsed, falling forward. Isabella quickly flew to him and caught him, preventing him from hitting the ground. Holding Frey by the chest, Isabella asked if he was all right, but she soon felt the chill of his body, which was completely numb. Isabella listened with wide eyes as Frey spoke about the need to find the phoenix. Carrying Frey, Isabella flew between the mountains and through gorges, expressing her amazement at his victory over Torqueda. However, Frey had a different view. Isabella looked at him in surprise when he mentioned that he had won only because of Torqueda's lack of battle experience. As they emerged from a gorge with a small river flowing through it, Isabella recalled Torqueda's long past. But Frey explained that there was a difference between experience in combat and in killing. He advised her always to remember that distinction. Frey, looking lifeless, explained to Isabella that strategy and tactics were essential in any battle. He remembered his fight, specifically the moment he created the ice spear. He had intentionally caused a mana explosion, making it seem as though he was using all his power in that one attack. But in reality, it had only been 80% of his strength. He had then moved behind Torqueda, using an ice scythe and striking with only 20% of his power. Isabella, holding Frey, recalled that massive spear, which had been just 80% of Frey's attack, and thanked him for the lesson he had taught her. Phoenix feathers lay scattered on the ground as Frey, now in better condition, stood gazing down. Isabella covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling up in her eyes. Frey and Isabella stood before the lifeless body of the phoenix, which had already died. Frey placed his hand on the phoenix, the very creature that had once saved his life. Using telekinesis magic, Frey lifted the phoenix's body, while Isabella watched, her head raised to follow the ascent. She saw the blood on its beak and closed eyes and asked Frey what he intended to do. Frey simply said he was going to save the phoenix. Before long, Frey and Isabella, with the phoenix's body in tow, arrived at Torqueda's fallen body, where Frey had recently cut into its chest. Isabella's eyes shone brightly as she watched the incredible scene unfold before her. She witnessed energy being drawn from Torqueda's heart into the phoenix's body. Frey, one hand in his pocket, stood before the phoenix as it absorbed the energy. He told Isabella that the phoenix would be resurrected once it had absorbed Torqueda's power. The mountains and flowing river seemed to split everything into two halves. Soon, little would remain of this place, for Torqueda had been the ruler of this mountain range. With his demise, a power struggle would break out among the monsters, who would fight to determine the new ruler of the mountains. A bloody conflict was brewing. Frey looked at the phoenix and declared it would become the new ruler. Without taking his eyes off the phoenix, Frey asked it to follow in Torqueda's footsteps, to rule the mountain range and protect his friend's dungeon. As Frey gazed at the night sky, where the stars twinkled faintly alongside the moon, he said he eagerly awaited their next meeting. We are transported to the city of Kosymphony, in the center of which stood a fountain, surrounded by houses that were strikingly different from one another. Children played joyfully in the streets while their mothers chatted nearby. Frey, dressed in a robe, sat on a bench, watching the passers-by. His hair tied back in a ponytail, he wore a purple robe over a white shirt. Frey turned his head when he heard Isabella's voice telling him she had reserved seats on the ship. Isabella approached him with a bottle of juice, informing him that there were no ships available for the day, and then handed the juice to Frey, who thanked her for her efforts. As Frey drank the juice, Isabella asked how he was feeling. Frey, still sipping, mentioned that he needed to try to put on some weight. Isabella sat down beside him, mentioning that Schweitzer's armor from Torqueda's nest had proven to be incredibly useful. The salamander's mantle, with its strong fire resistance, had protected them from the icy river. Frey lowered the bottle, nodding in agreement. Isabella touched the spatial bag at her side, questioning if it was necessary to bring all the weapons from the nest, as the bag had become quite heavy. Frey, still looking at the square, replied that even though the tools might not be needed, he couldn't leave his friend's belongings to rot in that place. The two sat quietly, sipping their juice. Isabella, holding her bottle with both hands, reminded Fry that the new semester was approaching and commented on how long this vacation had felt, like an entire year. Fry, closing one eye, disagreed, pointing out that they had only been in Hispaniola for a week. As they exchanged glances, Isabella suggested they visit Peruan's mansion. Fry, gazing at the sky with a few scattered clouds, asked about his whereabouts and eventually agreed to the idea. A short time later, Fry and Isabella stood at the entrance of the June family mansion. The gates were guarded by two knights in armor, armed with halberds. Fry and Isabella were both taken aback by the grandeur of the mansion. One of the guards, sporting a long mustache and wearing an unusually large black and burgundy beret, approached them and asked what had brought them to the estate. Fry, standing across from him, surprised the guard by asking if Peruan was home. The guard, recovering his composure, asked for their identities. However, Fry, not understanding the formality, simply replied that he was Peruan's friend. The guard, awkwardly raising his hand, asked for Frey's name, silently marveling at the young man's audacity despite his youth. Fry smiled and introduced himself fully. The guard suddenly remembered Peruan mentioning that his friend might visit before the holidays ended, and that his name was Fry, one of the three sons of the Blake family. Peruan had even warned the guard to treat Fry with the utmost respect. With his mouth agape, the guard recalled Peruan's instructions and now realized that this boy was indeed the friend of the young master. Not noticing the guard's bewilderment, Fry continued to admire the massive mansion in front of him. A carriage rushed toward the mansion, kicking up dust behind it. The second guard shouted that the lady of the house had arrived. A luxurious black carriage, adorned with gold, pulled up to the gates, prompting Fry and Isabella to turn and look. The coachman, a bald man with hair remaining only at the back of his head, brought the carriage to a stop right in front of them. The carriage door opened to reveal a strikingly beautiful girl with golden hair, who descended with the coachman's assistance, asking what was going on. Lelia stepped out of the carriage, her jade-blue eyes sparkling, and her golden hair shimmering in the sunlight. Both guards were flustered by her presence, with one even leaning his halberd against his shoulder as he scratched the back of his head awkwardly. The guard gestured toward Isabella and Fry, explaining that a friend of the young master Peruan had come to visit. Isabella, turning to look at Fry, became curious about this friend of her brother. Her lips curled into a faint smile as she looked at Fry, recalling something. Lelia clasped her hands in front of her and told Fry how much she had heard about him from her brother. She then pointed to Isabella and correctly guessed her name, leaving Isabella momentarily confused. Isabella, her mouth slightly open, attempted to ask a question but was cut off. Lelia approached the carriage and invited them inside, introducing herself as Peruan's sister to avoid any misunderstandings. Isabella, feeling a bit embarrassed, wrapped her arms around her waist, while Fry simply smiled faintly, unfazed by Lelia's beauty. Isabella blushed. Despite being a girl herself, Lelia's beauty left her breathless. One of the guards, still scratching his head, voiced concerns about Fry and Isabella's unconfirmed identities and asked Lelia to wait a moment. With a simple smile, Lelia glanced at the guard without saying a word. The guard's face flushed, and his eyes widened in awe of her beauty. He quickly saluted, grasping his halberd with his other hand, and apologized for his behavior. The carriage, led by the coachman, entered the mansion's grounds. Fry, seated with his arms crossed inside the carriage, stared out the window, wondering at the size of the mansion, as he still had not seen the main building. Lelia sat across from Fry, watching him with interest. Surprised by his question, she became slightly flustered when Fry asked why she was staring at him. Fry, without turning his head, inquired if she had something to tell him. Lelia, resting her hands on her hips, remarked that he was different from how her brother had described him, noting that she had heard Frey's hair was gray, not white. Fry raised a hand, playing with a strand of his hair, and responded by saying that a lot had happened since then. Lelia leaned forward slightly, suggesting they speak informally since he was a friend of her brother and a member of the Blake family. Fry immediately accepted the offer, which left Lelia stunned at how quickly he agreed. A bead of sweat formed on her face as Fry, unfazed by Isabella's protests, asked Lelia what the issue was. After all, she had asked him to be informal. Regaining her composure, Lelia closed her eyes and mentioned that she had heard Fry and her brother had studied together at West Road Academy, asking him how her brother fared there. Frey's response made Lelia open her eyes in shock. Fry mentioned that Peruin was in his second year, so they hadn't really crossed paths much. A realization dawned on Lelia. Fry was 2 years younger than her, which explained why there wasn't a significant difference between them. Lelia silently gazed at Fry with her blue eyes, watching him as Isabella scolded him, playfully hitting his legs. She wondered if her brother was truly friends with someone like this. On the grounds of the Peruin estate stood a grand house, with a large fountain and square ponds surrounded by a vast green garden. Fry and Isabella walked directly behind Lelia, passing a fountain with a statue of an ancient girl pouring water from a jug. As they walked, a blond man appeared ahead with his arms at his sides. Peruin greeted Fry loudly and cheerfully, asking why he had arrived so late. Approaching Fry, Peruin clapped a hand on his shoulder and asked with a smile if he had completed all his tasks. Fry, closing his eyes contentedly, nodded in agreement. Peruin immediately noticed that Frey's hair, which had once been gray, was now white, and commented on the change, while Lelia listened to their conversation from the sidelines, watching with suspicion. When Fry remarked that he was tired and hungry, Peruin laughed, saying it was obvious without him even mentioning it. Lelia, observing them with her blue eyes, noticed how excited her brother seemed and realized she had never seen him so lively before. She closed her eyes calmly. Lelia folded her hands and announced her presence, asking her brother if he hadn't noticed her. Peruin, puzzled, turned to her, but quickly recovered, extending a hand toward her with a soft smile, addressing her as princess, much to Frey's disappointment. When Peruin asked how the party had gone, Lelia, slightly irked, responded that she had been overlooked until now, which clearly irritated Fry. Peruin attempted to address her by name, but Lelia, driven by jealousy, turned away, wishing him a good time with his friend and walking off. Peruin, confused, apologized and placed a hand to his chin, trying to understand what had upset her. Fry, frowning, threw a displeased glance at him, saying it was baffling that he had called his sister princess so casually, leaving Peruin bewildered. The friends wandered around the June estate, and Peruin brought up Frey's trip to the Hellish Mountains, which surprised Fry since he didn't recall sharing that detail. The blonde led Fry and Isabella through a long, luxurious corridor lined with white columns. Turning to Fry, Peruin mentioned that he had heard about it from his fiancée, whom Fry had saved in the mountains, causing Fry to repeat what he had just heard in surprise. Isabella joined in, smiling as she suggested that the fiancée must be Sonia, to which Peruin responded affirmatively, hoping that Sonia, Sir Luther, and the sisters had arrived safely. Peruin sighed in relief, his expression softening into a gentle smile. He added that his fiancée was still practicing fencing diligently, and at her age she fully deserved her high knighthood. Meanwhile, Sonia swung her weapon furiously, slicing through the air with powerful strikes. The battle scars on her lean but muscular arms were clearly visible. After hearing Peruin's words, Fry laughed suddenly, calling it a waste of time, causing Peruin to glance at him questioningly. Changing the subject, Fry asked where they were heading now, and Peruin explained that they were following an important rule to greet the members of the June family first. Peruin smiled slightly and glanced at Fry with his blue eyes. Excited, Peruin rested a hand on the grand doors, ready to introduce his friends from the Magic Academy to his father. The doors opened to reveal a room adorned with a golden chandelier and arched windows in an antique style that lined the entire wall. A long table was set with tea and sweets, and the entire June family was gathered around, waiting to meet the guests. Seated at the table were 2 young blonde princes with blue eyes, who were the youngest family members, one of whom cast a curious glance at the newcomers. On the other side of the table sat the familiar face of Princess Lelia, enjoying her dessert, alongside the matriarch, June, dressed in white, elegantly sipping her tea. Peruin, raising his light eyebrows, watched awkwardly as the maid poured his tea. At the head of the table sat the family patriarch, who extended his hand to Fry and Isabella, introducing himself and inquiring about the health of Earl Blake. Isabella froze, overwhelmed by the man's impressive presence, while Fry, closing his eyes and folding his hands, responded warmly, saying his father was in good health. However, Fry, with Lucas inside him, grew slightly anxious, biting his lip. He had borrowed this body but had never actually met the real Frey's father before. Afterward, Fry cast a cold, calculating gaze at his host. He looked closely at Shepherd June, the father of the family, a 7-star mage and the master of the 4th tower, one of the 5 most distinguished individuals in the Empire. Frey's eyes glowed blue as he pondered whether this man could be the key to unlocking the secrets of the demigods. Setting his teacup down on its saucer, Shepherd mentioned that the 6th tower was quite far, which limited his opportunities to meet with Earl Blake to once a year during tower meetings. Fry, putting on a deliberately somber expression, apologized for the infrequent visits, to which Shepherd noted that conversations with his father were always deep and meaningful. Fry continued to study his host's face intently, observing even the smallest details. He was certain that the crescent moon tattoo under Shepherd's eye was the work of Sherway. Remembering how Fry had saved Sonia, Shepherd expressed his heartfelt gratitude in front of the entire family, but Fry humbly replied that thanks were unnecessary. Afterward, Shepherd curiously inquired what kind of business had led Fry to the hellish mountains. Isabella cast a saddened glance at Fry when he vaguely explained that he had personal matters in the mountains. Shepherd, confused and frowning, asked again for clarification, and Peruin looked at his friend with curiosity. However, Fry replied that it was merely a trivial matter not worth troubling the Lord with. Hearing this, the head of the family chuckled softly and accepted the answer. Outside, the sun shone brightly on the estate's light-colored walls, and inside the dining room, Shepherd inquired how the preparations for the upcoming banquet were going. Peruin reassured him that everything was well underway. With a serious expression, Shepherd reminded his son that many important guests would be in attendance, instructing him to ensure everything went smoothly. Peruin, bowing his head slightly and closing his eyes, showed he understood the gravity of the situation, while his middle brother gazed forward with boredom, and the youngest yawned. After this brief exchange, Peruin turned to Fry, inviting him to accompany him, though Shepherd was pleased with this idea too. Raising his hand excitedly, Shepherd mentioned he had been working on some magic lately and would be interested in Frey's opinion. Peruin remained silent, while Fry, unsure of how he could contribute, expressed his doubt. Shepherd, however, reassured him that any input would be valuable. Shepherd cheerfully explained that he sought fresh perspectives and inspiration, and for that, he needed to hear the thoughts of the younger magician. Fry, his hair tied in a ponytail, raised an eyebrow, still hesitant to accept the offer. Meanwhile, the youngest family members began to rise from the table, stretching. Following their lead, Peruin invited Fry to meet him later in the banquet hall, wishing him good luck. Fry asked Isabella to assist Peruin, and she agreed with a nod and a smile. Now, seated at the large table where only candelabras remained, Shepherd and Fry faced each other. Fry waited as Shepherd addressed him by his full name, prompting him to look up with his gray eyes. Leaning his head on his folded hands, the man's glowing blue eyes bore into Fry, and after a brief pause, he got straight to the point. Silence lingered as Shepherd continued to stare intently at Fry. Growing increasingly anxious, Fry tried to grasp what the head of the family was getting at, cold sweat forming on his brow. Shepherd's intense blue gaze remained fixed on his guest, his dissatisfaction evident. He finally asked, in a stern tone, why a member of the Troman Brotherhood had come to his home. Taken aback, Fry stammered, suggesting there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Shepherd commented on how clever it had been to use Peruin as a way to gain entry to the estate, wondering aloud if Fry had known that this day would come. Pointing at him, Shepard remarked that it was reckless to come here under such circumstances, leaving Fry mentally puzzled. The head of the family's concerns became clearer when he pointed to the tapen earrings Fry wore. Pulling back the turquoise triangle, Fry stared at the earrings in surprise. He assumed the fraternity was some academy club led by Peruan. Fry calmly asserted that he had no idea what Shepard was talking about, explaining that the earrings were found in the mountains of Spain and were his personal item. The blond man, still bewildered, asked if Fry truly wasn't a member of the Troman Brotherhood. Fry, showing no emotion, confirmed that he wasn't part of any such group. He added that Peruan had once asked him to join, but he declined, as he didn't enjoy being in clubs. Shepard looked at him skeptically but remained quiet. Suddenly rising from his chair, Shepard slammed his hands on the table and shouted that he wasn't referring to the club Peruan had created. Full of rage, the man's piercing gaze remained on Fry. Regaining control over his temper, Shepard abruptly sat back down, concluding that the young man before him must simply be a wanderer. Covering his face with one hand in embarrassment, he realized he had misunderstood the situation entirely and asked Fry not to worry. Fry, now more composed, responded with an air of confidence, urging Shepard to continue. The head of the family, glancing at Fry, commented on his boldness. With a grim expression, Shepard raised his index finger and asked Fry where he believed he was at that moment. The young man, perplexed, answered that he was at a friend's house. Shocked by the response, Shepard stared at him in disbelief. Fry confidently reiterated that he was simply visiting a comrade. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Peruan rushed around, carrying a bread basket as he helped with preparations for the banquet. Isabella, dressed in a white waiter's apron and holding a silver tray, carefully arranged glasses of a pink drink on the table. Shepard paused for a moment, remaining silent. Eventually, he accepted Frey's words, clasping his hands together and closing his eyes. He admitted that while he still wasn't completely convinced of Frey's innocence, he was willing to explain his earlier rudeness. Glancing at Fry, Shepard promised not to treat him as an outsider, since he had those earrings, but warned that as long as Fry wore them, he couldn't ignore the possible connection to the Troman Brotherhood. Frey's eyes widened in surprise when Shepard asked who the true ruler of the continent was. Shepard went on to speak, declaring that the Cascaw Empire was one of humanity's greatest nations but only held a tenth of the continent's landmass. Looking down, Fry clenched his hands and finally began to speak. He echoed Shepard's earlier words, acknowledging that power on the nameless continent was held by intellectuals, as well as humans and various factions claiming dominance. Then, Fry said there was only one true ruler controlling the continent from the shadows, and Shepard's hands began to tremble. Trying to steady himself, Shepard clenched his fists even tighter. With a hard stare, Shepard added that this true ruler was none other than a demigod. Hearing this, Fry was visibly shocked. Covering part of his face with his hand, Shepard continued, stating that ultimate power resided with being superior to ordinary humans. While Fry stared at him in confusion, Shepard explained that these entities were the real predators, ruling over human society. Frowning, Shepard suggested that Fry might see this as nothing more than a far-fetched conspiracy theory. When Fry started to tremble, overwhelmed with shock, Shepard asked him what was wrong. The main character recalled that only 5 people, including himself, had risked their lives to fight against the demigod. Now, 1,000 years later, a world controlled by a demigod, with its order and discipline distorted, felt hopeless. Lucas, in Frey's body, was astonished that people were still striving toward the same goal as him, and their numbers were steadily growing. A puzzled Shepard asked if he had said something strange. Clenching his fists, Fry suddenly realized that people across the continent, aware of the demigod's existence, were holding their breath, never giving up, waiting for the right moment. Shepard asked why the young man was smiling when a slight smile crept onto Frey's face, accompanied by a tremor. Pursing his lips, Fry thought that for the first time in this era, he had glimpsed a ray of hope. Shepard inquired whether Fry knew anything about the demigod, and Fry confirmed that he did. Breathing deeply to calm his intense emotions, Fry realized he had found an ally in the head of the June family, but decided not to reveal his true identity yet. Instead, he mentioned with enthusiasm that there was a note from Schweitzer near the earrings. At this, an emotional Shepard stood up abruptly, shouting and asking if Fry still had the note. Fry gave him a serious look and nodded. Shepard, filled with curiosity, stood waiting. Then, closing his eyes with humility, the blonde realized Fry needed to hear some information first. Shepard explained sharply that they knew very little about demigods, their numbers, their true purpose, or why they operated from the shadows. Fry listened closely from the other side of the table. Shepard went on to say that these beings were powerful enough to wipe out entire races on a whim. Fry appeared bored because he already knew these significant historical facts. When Shepard mentioned the failed attempts made against the demigods, Fry looked down, confident that the number of efforts was fewer than 100. Yet each of these beings was comparable to a planetary catastrophe. Shepard then delved into the history of events from 4,000 years ago. With his hands clasped and his eyes glowing blue, Shepard recounted that 5 legendary heroes fought against the demigod back then. These heroes were well-known figures: the Supreme Sage Schweitzer, the Warrior King Kasigen, the Swordsman Jerusid, the Black Witch Iris, and the Archmage Lucas. However, after the Archmage disappeared, relationships among the others began to deteriorate. A conflict arose between the Warrior King and the Swordsman, and the Black Witch vanished completely. Only the Great Sage remained and fought to the bitter end, but it wasn't enough to defeat the demigod. Their names disappeared from history when the last warrior died. That was the story Shepard told Fry as sunlight streamed through the large windows into the dining room. Fry carefully considered the information, realizing that it matched what was recorded in Schweitzer's diary, indicating that Shepard was well informed. Shepard closed his eyes and revealed that he belonged to a secret circle that carried on the will of the 5 warriors. At that moment, Fry again took note of the tattoo on Shepard's face. Fry asked about the name in amazement, and Shepard explained that it was merely a title for the collective group, but, in reality, it was fragmented. Over the years, Shepard said, the once unified will had splintered, with members now keeping each other in check. Fry, resting his cheek on his hand, sighed in frustration, thinking that once more than 3 people gathered, politics inevitably got in the way. Shepard further explained that the most powerful circles now were the ones led by the likes of Straw Necklace, to which he belonged, Fistman Amlet with the purple sun emblem, and Roshid Soph, whose symbol was the sword. Fry was surprised to learn that 3 of these circles had taken the names of heroes, and he wondered about his own and Cassigen's names. Meanwhile, Shepard reported that things were not going well in the Troman Brotherhood. Fry frowned when he learned that the leader of that circle had died, and half of the remaining members had moved to another circle, concluding that politics was indeed a curse. Sunlight illuminated the fireplace, where candles and a small clock stood. Fry asked what had happened to the successors of the Warrior King. Shepard replied that Cassigen's legacy had been passed down to 1 person per generation, but no one knew where the current heir was. Fry raised his hand, asking if these circles were separate from the clubs run by Academy cadets. Rising from his seat and walking away, Shepard explained that the Academy clubs were merely for fun. Pouring wine into a glass, he added that sometimes, when members of a circle discovered exceptional talents, they would approach the cadets, who were unaware of the existence of these secret circles. Now standing by the liquor cabinet, Shepard explained that having many similar names for secret societies wasn't a bad thing, as it reduced the chances of discovery. Handing Fry a glass with a golden rim, Shepard confidently stated that demigods couldn't see or hear everything happening around them. As Shepard took a sip from his ornate glass, Fry held his own, gazing off to the side in deep thought. After finishing his drink, Shepard placed the glass on the table and turned his back to Fry, admitting that he had been watching him for some time because of the tape-in earrings, which were once Lucas's heirloom. Explaining the reason for his initial suspicion and rudeness, Shepard concluded his speech and turned slightly to face Fry, giving him a serious look. Fry, still somewhat stunned, was taken aback when Shepard asked how he had acquired those earrings. Shepard grimly confirmed that Fry had gotten them in the mountains of Spain. Shepard remarked that he had heard rumors about hero artifacts being there, but few who ventured to retrieve them ever returned alive. Fry stared sharply at Shepard, realizing that it made sense. It wasn't easy to locate the dungeon, and even if brave adventurers managed to find it, the terrifying king of the drakes, Torquata, would never let them leave. Leaning on the table's edge, Fry glanced at the glass in his hand and said that luck had played a part, as he had found himself in trouble and wandered in an unknown direction. When Fry casually mentioned stumbling upon Schweitzer's dungeon, Shepard, in utter shock, loudly demanded clarification. He shouted, asking if Fry had truly found a note from Schweitzer. Fry, looking bored, calmly confirmed. Shepard's jaw dropped in disbelief when Fry said that the contents of the note were almost identical to what he had just explained earlier. The Duke furiously demanded to know how to access the dungeon, but Fry, with feigned awkwardness, reminded him that he found it by accident and couldn't help. Feeling slightly desperate, Shepard lowered his gaze to the floor. Raising his hands in defeat, he admitted that he still had lingering doubts about Fry. Confused, Fry raised his eyebrows when Shepard requested to see the earrings in action. Fry immediately placed the ornate, empty glass on the red table. In the next instant, the turquoise triangle began to glow, slightly floating away from his neck. A powerful whirlwind formed around Fry, making his long tail sway, while a blue aura radiated from his body. Surrounded by magic, Fry asked if that was enough for the astonished Shepard. The man's eyes widened in shock before he closed them a moment later. Shepard remarked that this wasn't the worst scenario, and Fry looked at him, puzzled. The head of the June family, looking grim, admitted that he didn't fear Fry because he suspected him of being a member of the Troman Brotherhood. It was already night outside, the dark sky dotted with stars, and lights gleamed in every window of the estate. The Duke's reception had gathered many important figures, and everything in the hall was perfect, from the luxurious decor to the tables brimming with dishes. The atmosphere was filled with splendor as the guests filled the room. Some engaged in lively conversation over glasses of sparkling wine, while others sat more quietly on velvet sofas, mingling away from the crowd. Standing apart from the others, dressed in a luxurious tailcoat, Fry leaned against the wall, holding a glass of champagne as he observed the guests. He reflected on how he had finally found people who knew about the demigod, but the situation seemed to grow more complicated. Staring at his glass, Fry mused that it was reassuring to know circles were named after the 5 heroes, and that there were those who still carried on their will. Fry realized he needed to learn more about the circle, calm the power of the icy river, and complete Anastasia, Schweitzer's goal. Suddenly, he grasped his head, overwhelmed by the weight of his troubles. Lucas, deep in thought, wondered if his synchronization with Fry wasn't mere coincidence. Meanwhile, Isabella, now in an elegant gown, holding a plate of food, noticed him from across the room. Fry glanced up as she approached, asking what he was thinking about. Standing beside him, Isabella showed off the new dress that Lady Lelia had gifted her. Isabella, bewildered, widened her eyes and blushed slightly when Fry casually commented that she was fortunate to lead such an easy life. The girl reacted as if struck by something absurd, yelling and asking what he meant by that. Fry calmly sipped his champagne as the earlier conversation with Shepard replayed in his mind. Back then, Fry had been stunned when Shepard mentioned that a month ago, during a meeting at the tower, he had heard rumors that someone had made contact with a demigod. Fry had furiously demanded to know who it was, while Shepard had only looked at him in silence, his expression dark. Fray's eyes widened in shock as he heard the name of the person. Isaac Blake, Fray's father, whose body Lucas now inhabited.